Okay, so I've got the recording on now. All right. Let's wait a few minutes to see if the folks from the Instituto will be coming to give us a message from the Instituto. And if they don't, then we'll just get started in 2 or 3 minutes. Entonces, estamos en espera de la gente del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe para ver si van a venir para darnos para abrir el evento, pero si no, entonces vamos a empezar dentro de 3 minutos. Okay, so let's just wait a few minutes to see if they come, and then if they don't, then we'll get started. In any case, we have a really great program today. It will last for 3 hours. Let's take a look at that. So here are the different presentations. Aquí en la pantalla se puede ver las presentaciones que se van a dar durante estas 3 horas. So the first presentation will be a panel titled Silent Rebels, Exploring the Revolutionary Roles of Enslaved African Women. The second panel will be on LGBTQIA2S plus transpositions across Afro-Atlantic and Afro-Indian zones of contact and contestation. The third panel is titled Longue Durée, Durée Profonde, and Decolonial Linguistics in Africa and Beyond. And the fourth is called Intersectionality and Racist Ethnocentric Discourse in the Afro-Atlantic. The fifth presentation is titled Psychological Healing Through Cultural Memory. The sixth one is Linguistic Landscapes in the Afro-Atlantic. Entonces tenemos 6 presentaciones hoy. La primera se intitula Silent Rebels, Exploring the Revolutionary Roles of Enslaved African Women. La segunda, LGBTQIA2S+, Transpositions Across Afro-Atlantic and Afro-Indian Zones of Contact and Contestation. Número 3, Longue Durée, Durée Profonde, and Decolonial Linguistics in Africa and Beyond. We make the road by walking. Número 4, Intersectionality and the Racist Ethnocentric Discourse in the Afro-Atlantic. Número 5, Psychological Healing Through Cultural Memory. Number 6, Linguistic Landscapes in the Afro-Atlantic. Okay, we don't have anybody coming from the Instituto, so I'm going to allow Professor Kuabong, the co-presenter today, to just give a few words about the program and about maybe a little bit of history of Caribe, of Simposio Caribe Plurilingue, and how we've reached this milestone of celebrating our 19th symposium. So I'll give I'll hand over to Professor Kuabong to maybe fill us in on a little bit of that. Entonces, yo voy a dar la palabra a Profesor Kuabong para darnos una introducción al evento de hoy. We don't have I think you're muted, Professor Guabong. Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
Here we
so
go.
I'm back now, yes. I was just saying that welcome everyone to this 19th celebration of Caribe Plurilingue. And I don't have to talk too much because we've gone through Maria, we've gone through COVID, we've gone through so many other problems, yet this symposium designed as a brainchild of Professor Faraklas and me as the kind of midwife, helping to bring it to fruition, and that we have never given up on this program. Some semesters we've tried to see whether we can do it or not, and yet always students and other people are willing to sustain the program through their presentations, and also out of these presentations, publications have been realized. The idea was to help our graduate students who are not able to go to conferences to present their research so that they can present this research online through the Institute of Caribbean Studies. And I think that the Institute has given us a lot of support by providing us the spaces when we can meet face-to-face, and also providing us the template to organize the conference every semester. So as you can see from there have been recordings over the years. So if you go online, I'm sure you can find some of the programs that have been recorded by the Institute. And also you can see why this symposium is extremely important to graduate students. And on the few occasions we've had presentations from across other parts of the world, not just Puerto Rico. And this year, I think we have a presentation from Canada and other places. So welcome everybody. This is a fiesta before the semester ends. And I think it's also for those students who are writing your final papers for the semester, this should be a boost. That yes, you are actually becoming stars. You are being watched across the world, and you are not afraid to expose your brilliance to the world. Thank you and welcome.
Okay, well, with that stellar introduction, I think it's time to get started.
Okay, this is the first panel, and before I introduce the panelists, I want all of you to think of Acapuria, Pastelas, Mondongo, Mofongo, Botanicas, Brujas and Brujos, and all those deliciously mentionable Puerto Rican cultural things. You also think about bomba, the kind of clothing the dancers wear, the headgear, etc., etc. And with that in mind, the presenters are Jacqueline Jiang Chio, Caroline M. Suarez Rodriguez, Isanda Berrios Diaz, and Leishla M. Davila Rodriguez. And I am the moderator, meaning I just keep quiet and sit down with a big smile and allow the presenters to take over. So over to you, panelists.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be doing the introduction of our panel. If we can move the slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to start with a little bit of a framework of why we're doing this today. The study of the Caribbean slave person or neo-slave narrative has been determined by contemporary post-slavery, post-colonial, and postmodern theories that see resistance as the only lifestyle of the enslaved and rebellion. First, the fiction from the English, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish colonies gain greater focus. First, often male author texts are selected to celebrate violent insurrections, infanticide, mass suicide, abortion, and escape. Yet, when we examine female author texts, we discover the effectiveness of acts of subversion embedded in the performance of predominantly female enslaved duties such as healers, midwives, needle workers, cooks, washerwomen, mothers, and lovers. These acts, highly coerced yet not openly resisted or subverted, and which facilitated the operations of slave plantations, must also be reevaluated as resistance, but in a different way, as we argue here. For our purpose, we chose Hispanic, Caribbean, Puerto Rican female author, woman-centric fiction of the 21st century, the works of Dalma Llanos Figueroa, Daughters of the Stone, and A Woman of Endurance.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa, and I'm going to continue talking about the theoretical assertion. For instance, Deborah E. McDowell has asserted that female-centered slave narratives provide new ways of theorizing about enslaved female gender subjectivity and displays more complex contextual and historical perspectives, not only on what was done to these slave women, but what they did with what was done to them. Continuing, Lucille McLaren, Barbara Bush, and Hilary Beckles split the various nonviolent ways enslaved female resistance. For example, abortion, infanticide, poisoning, womb shrinkage, and sexual abstinence when possible. To quote, as a nonviolent protesters, as protectors of social culture, and as mothers, enslaved Black women were critical to the forging of resistance strategies, and their anti-slavery consciousness is the core of the slave community's survivalist culture. However, Marietta Morrissey and Sidaya Hartman draw attention to the interpretative narrowness of these generalizations. They critique the overcentering of resistance on the enslaved African Caribbean female's body and draw attention to its Aryan-American origins, traceable to the European white male's fixation on African female sexuality. They reject the perpetual association of every mood by the enslaved as deliberate subversion of confrontation with the brutality of the enslavers. Furthermore, Jenny Sharp actually argues that an expansion of the theory of enslaved women's resistance to include superstitious actions without erasing the unequal power relations that restricted the ability of enslaved women to act in ways that did not threaten their lives and survival. Sharp then advocates for a more complex approach to the exploration of the term resistance in slave narratives.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Jiang. I'll be continuing with the theoretical assertions. Analysts must therefore consider how enslaved people acted to improve their lives without direct and confrontational acts of resistance. To always equate resistance with, quote, oppositional consciousness is often difficult, end quote. These acts are often unpredictable and indemonstrable. Because of the unequal power dynamic at play, we cannot see all master-slave relations as resistance. They could also be read as accommodation, abrogation, assimilation, or, quote, resistance within accommodation, end quote. Accordingly, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot asserts that if every action by the enslaved is resistance, then the term has become a cliche and loses its critical efficacy cited in Mintz. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alexander Berrios, and I'm going to continue with theoretical assertions. We argue that Llanos Figueroa's novels evidently support these positions, not through fragmentary and incidental mentions, often seen in slave narratives, but by presenting, and I quote, slave women participation in collective and individual acts of resistance, end of quote. Resistance as acts of survival. Our presentation also borrows ideas from Carol Weaver's medical revolutionaries, the enslaved healers of 18th century Saint-Domingue, 2006. It says herbalists, diviners, nurses, midwives, and veterinary practitioners flourish in the medical world of 18th century Saint-Domingue, using European, African, and Caribbean remedies. They treated the maladies of enslaved people, white residents, and animals. While these enslaved medical practitioners were an important part of the plantation economy and colonial prosperity, they ultimately roused other slaves to rebel against and overthrow their enslavement.
Okay, so we're gonna start to read our papers. I'm gonna remind first, and it's titled Love as Healing and Resistance in a Woman of Endurance. Again, my name is Caroline Suarez. To read las entrelíneas of a book written by an Afro-Caribbean woman and find the missing pieces written in history by captors, colonialists, and oppressors is to consider her relevance as a historian curandera, a concept proposed by Roberta Hurtado. Hurtado argued that this artist as curandera constructs a decolonial tradition of resilience that moves the community to heal from the wounds of colonization. Remembering Gloria Anzaldúa, Medicine of Art, the history retold by Afro descendants in the Caribbean serves as a frame for a literary decolonial resistance that helps as a revised and painful revisit of history, but as a part of a healing process for the community. Likewise, Dalma Llanos Figueroa, in A Woman of Endurance, proposes love as the pathway to healing and resisting colonial narratives and the colonial desire to break down the Black female body and soul in the Caribbean. Can we move the slide? Thank you. In A Woman of Endurance, we meet Paula, who was born with the gift of touch, pointing her to the illness and pain of the person she touched. Her hands talked to her and made sense of the world. However, once captured, she inevitably had to feel the body of a man attacking her. Paula decided at that moment to renounce that gift because her hands were allowing her to see darkness she could not bear. And I quote, through her hands, she learned of the malice, the threat, the pain and cruelty, the cold hatred, the unspeakable brutality in the hearts of many men. Close quote. The closing of her hands meant the closing of her heart too, which she refused to open after being ripped from her land and sold to reproduce more enslaved people. Her reality changes when she's sold in Puerto Rico for a second time and arrives at La Hacienda Las Mercedes, where she meets Rufina, who identifies herself as a curandera. Paula comes to La Hacienda severely hurt and in need of care. And Rufina does not only embody the figure of a healer, but also the one of a loving mother. Rufina opens her home to a stranger and restores Paula's health with her knowledge of herbs and food medicine. She makes Paula a fragrance stew and gives her coconut water while advising, and I quote, eat, drink. El agua de coco helps the healing, and the stew will make you strong again. Quote. This gesture humbles Paula because she had forgotten the taste of lovingly prepared good food. And I quote, this meal takes her back to her village. The memory brings tears to her eyes. Close quote. Rufina first focuses on healing Paula's body through food. Food also provides the pathway to mental healing. The food provokes pleasant cultural memories and connects Paula's spirits with her ancestor, comforting her in her trauma. In the space of La Hacienda, Paula reconnects with nature, a place of healing, a temple of her own. Recognizing the presence of her ancestors and her homeland in Rufina, Paula imagines herself in a forest and seeks out a natural forest where she often retreats on Sundays. Paula started escaping to nature every Sunday as a ritual of self-care, which translates as resistance when an enslaved person intentionally carved time for herself, the time when no one owned her. In nature, Paula finds the, and I quote, only black tree she has ever seen. It rises majestically, taller and wider than any of its neighbors. Close quote. This tree becomes Paula's safe space to sort out her conflicting feelings and starts discovering pieces of herself that she has long buried. This tree not only serves as a healing temple, but also as a mirror where she encounters her true self and her strength. It is in the closeness of this tree and in the healing space of nature that Paula finds Chachita. Like Paula, Chachita is a young girl that needs medical attention after living by herself in the forest in Marunash. In front of Chachita, Paula mirrors Rufina, la curandera, bringing the girl food and company and finding a way to heal Chachita's ear, which could end up hard of hearing if she did not receive any treatment. This relationship allows Paula to work on her own healing process since she was never allowed to mother her own children. Therefore, she begins to nurture and care for Chachita. Paula is determined to do everything to help heal the girl's ears. She subsequently appeals to Yemaya to return to her the gift of healing by touch. But when Paula touches Shashita to cure her ears, she is confronted with her own trauma, and I quote, she now exists in non-space, beyond the limits of her consciousness, floating in a nebula. She drifts alone, cold, lost, and in that space of being alone, Paula is assaulted by images of the past, the most caustic memories, the bitterest experiences. She's forced to suffer them again. Quote, in this space of mutual healing, Paula prays she can protect and heal Shashita while the girl experiences something she has not felt in a long time, safe, warm, and comfortable. Shashita thinks that she could stay in that space forever, supremely happy, wondering if that is what feels like to have a mother. The narrative does not clarify if Paula heals the girl's ears, but before Shashita disappears, the comfort and nourishment of a mother figure helped her cure her loneliness that came with living in Marunach. Paula also finds someone she shows maternal love to compensate for the loss of her children, while Simon acts as the father figure for Chashita. Love as a friend, as a mother, or as a romantic partner is an evident healing property proposed in the novel and is palpable through the relationship between Paula and Simon. Elina Valovirta mentions the participation of men in women's liberation quests written by Caribbean female writers who write against the negative conception of men in the islands. Although Simon is also a father figure for Shashita, he also takes on the responsibility of protecting Paula. In return, Paula helps him recover from the brutal whipping he received after returning from the forest where he went to help Shashita. Simon is the first to offer Paula his love as healing, and I quote, you took care of my body when it was broken. Now maybe I can repay you. I hear it's your heart that needs healing. Quote, he proposes that the only way for them to carry their burdens is to share them and calls love the one to help her carry her load. Simone is aware of Paula's gift of touch and asks to touch her. Paula's allowance to let a man come close enough to feel her wounds is the image of Paula opening herself again and accepting her to be loved. Simon's words introduce the notion of a mirror as a healing portal. He reaffirms healing in togetherness, and I quote, and then you came, bearing scars and rage much like my own, and I recognized you. You bit my hand, and I thought, ah, I have found another warrior woman. Quote, Valorbita points to the desire of Caribbean writers to rewrite men beyond the stereotypical representation, but in a reparative and participatory way. The The scenes that make space for caring intimacy between women and men also suggest a form of liberation. As a historian, curandera Dalma Llanos Figueroa brings to life the idea of individual healing to help the community. A healed heart can help others in their journey to healing. Love binds people in their suffering and creates a community of collective resistance and survival against their oppression. Love creates spaces for sharing individual stories and struggles and crafting resistance strategies to survive and heal. This novel rewrites in Caribbean history that love as resistance is essential to survive and to recover, to recognize the body as a human temple deserving of good things. To conclude, the words of the character of Tia Josefa are relevant to understand the importance of claiming back humanity to love ourselves and others in the face of slavery and colonization. And I quote, "We all carry our nightmares in spoken places. The details may be different, but the outcome is the same. They want to steal our humanity to ease the weight of their own souls. Don't you let them. Don't give them the one piece of you they can't take. Don't you become the empty vessel they want to believe you are." Thank you.
So, hello again. I'm going to be talking about the role of the costureras in the act of silent resistance. As we have heard, in the hacienda, there were many roles. Enslaved Africans were subjected to horrific conditions while living in the slave system, since they were frequently physically beaten. Although enslaved Africans suffered the pains of whiplashes severely restricting their agency, they still resisted the slave system that tried to erase their cultural ties to Africa. As a means of survival, they looked to struggle against the system by refusing to work, organizing slave revolts, escaping the plantations. However, another type of resistance was practiced, such as silent resistance. A woman of endurance exhibits the various roles an enslaved one may have performed on the Hacienda Las Mercedes. The narrative also discusses the costurera as an additional female role facilitating subtle acts of resistance in a woman of endurance. Housed in a workshop named Las Agujas, the enslaved seamstresses made clothing for the mistress of the hacienda, which she sold to the wealthiest woman in Puerto Rico. The initial presence of Pola at Las Agujas actually highlights the distinction between the seamstresses' seemingly effortless work and the field workers' physically exhausting labor. The 23 women, predominantly mulattas, would sit, talk, and sew the garments at the workshop and never experienced the backbreaking task of the cane cutters. Additionally, they would dress more admirably than the other enslaved women. It created a social imbalance among the enslaved people and actually generated jealousy and hatred within themselves. However, this imbalance never seriously undermined the collective resistance against the slave system. As Tia Josefa stated in the novel, an hacienda is an hacienda, and slaves are slaves. Some always get better than others. Even though there was some resentment from the enslaved people, the Suis actually created a community that fought against the system. They made African patterned cloth from scraps of material for their community. Enslaved Africans may have arrived naked in Puerto Rico and other colonies, but quickly blended European clothing styles with reimagined African style attires to create creolized clothing for themselves. Buckridge actually discusses in the language of dress resistance and accommodation in Jamaica, the power that dress has as resistance. Dress in any culture both adorns and protects the body. However, dress has other functions. Dress is political in that it brings people together and also puts them in contact with others. Therefore, dressing represents an individual's social status, class, religion. Enslaved Africans were not clothed in finery and received just enough clothing to cover their bodies, as we see in the picture. Most of their garments were bleached and formless, resembling sacks. The Hacienda Las Mercedes seamstresses would sew dresses for women who do little work, but the enslaved women would wear shapeless and loose dresses, depicting how the style determines social class within the novel. However, the seamstresses would take scraps of cloth left behind by clients to create modest embellishments for their clothes. Not only that, but would sew these embellishments onto clothing of other enslaved women in the hacienda, particularly on their Sunday clothes, which were the most admired set they owned. The embellishment could vary from intricate embroidery like delicate lace, pleats, ruffles, and ribbons, but they all actually worked intricately into the dress to camouflage the pieces. This artistry actually blindsided the free white female customers from noticing the sewers' actions. Therefore, by ingenuity in cloth making, the enslaved sewers were clothing from the same materials as their mistresses. The patrona's hand-me-downs also supplemented the clothing made from scraps. Buckridge states that the slaves' act of wearing their oppressor's clothes was reminiscent of the belief among some Africans that clothing had potency and that dress was strongly connected to spiritual world. Therefore, if the enslaved people wear the oppressor's clothing or even small pieces of it, the spirits of the enemy would weaken. We actually can see that in the novel. Buckridge proposes that some Africans in the Caribbean may have known about this notion. In A Woman of Endurance, the patron, Don Tomas' slow illness indicates the spirit-draining belief. Tomas' illness also then affects the operation of the hacienda. It is not until Llanos Figueroa's novel, Daughters of the Stone, that Maddie, a powerful healer, takes over Hacienda Las Mercedes and transforms it into a place of healing for the formerly enslaved people. Furthermore, the silent resistance presents in the novel was not only about customizing dresses and making them their own, but keeping African heritage alive by using accessories. For example, in the novel, some drummers would tie colorful pieces of cloth around African drums, paying homage to deities, such as red for Chango, green for Osain, blue for Yamaya. This dress code depicts how cloth had powerful meaning in African culture. Regarding dress, Buckridge states that slaves' women's African-inspired clothing provided a way to resist white oppressors' denigration of African customs. The head wrap was a piece of clothing worn by many slave women as an accessory. It performed several functions, including sun protection, balancing loads on their heads, preserving fresh hairstyles. Head wraps also signals one's ethnic origins in Africa. Furthermore, it could determine the type of work done in the plantation, such as cane cutter, the laundress, the nurse, the house servant, and the field workers. In the novel, the headdresses demonstrate the type of work engaged across Hacienda Las Mercedes. Paula was used to wearing a white head wrap that commonly field workers would wear and actually refused the ornate one that was given to her at Las Agujas. Paula's act of wearing, in this case, Paula's choosing the white head wrap actually depicts how it fostered a sense of collective identity for field workers that were cutting cane. These seamstresses established a community by transforming the scraps of clothing for the enslaved workers. They transformed plain clothing into something beautiful and wearable. Clothing the community was their role, and through it protected their bodies, in a sense, their cultural heritage. That is survival as resistance observed in the novel. Through fostering community survival strategies, they resisted the system until emancipation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Again, I am Jacqueline. I will be continuing with my part of the presentation titled Healing Hands Through Silence, Survival, and Solidarity, the Role of Caperlatas in Dalma Llanos Figueroa's A Woman of Endurance and Daughters of the Stone. Throughout her work, Llanos Figueroa deposits immense enthusiasm in the connection that the women in A Woman of Endurance and Daughters of the Stone have with the earth. mainly through feminine and spiritual knowledge. Using hands and the inner voice to transport energy and healing, Llanos Figueroa reminds her readers of the importance of the caperlata in Caribbean slave narratives of resistance. In Carol K. Weaver's Medical Revolutionaries, the Enslaved Healers of 18th Century Saint-Domingue, she writes the following, quote, "In the eyes of French and Creole officials, the caperlatas were the most dangerous element of the medical underworld of 18th century Saint-Domingue. During plantation slavery in the Caribbean, colonial authorities deemed them dangerous influences with the potential to destroy white society and grasp control of the island colony," end quote. The caperlata, through acts of healing and providing herbal cures and remedies to other enslaved people, created spaces for resistance through collective healing. As visibly noticeable with the characters of Kira, who is Pola, and Matilde, Fela's daughter. Through great sacrifice, both women are connected to the powers of Yemaya and Oshun and receive gifts of knowing that work as guiding actions to freedom. Kira, Pola's real name before arriving in Puerto Rico, is quick to reject her gift at the beginning of her journey on the Middle Passage. In A Woman of Endurance, Llanos Figueroa writes, quote, "Kira's hands told her everything, and sometimes more than she wanted to know. Yemaya's gift of knowing had been more than the girl had ever wanted or imagined. The knowing became a burden." End quote. And then she continues to write, quote, "Kira began to feel emotional vibrations for her fellow captives. The desperate confusion, the piercing pain, the raging anger, the numbing despair, all began to flow into her fingers. In the darkness, her mother's words returned to her once more. 'You delight in your gift now, but I fear it will cost you, my daughter, more than you or I can imagine,' end quote. Her mother, Illa's protective words guide her through her immense suffering, sexual violence, and enslavement. Still, it is only through her gift of healing that she can reconnect with Yemaya. As Pola begins to become a part of the collective transformations of Hacienda Las Mercedes, her diagnostic and healing hands that guide her greatly contribute to the freedom of the enslaved people that live at the Hacienda. It is when she finds the healing tree that her journey begins. Pola rediscovers her maternal instincts after meeting Chachita. She rediscovers her ability to emphasize and nurture others. In Chachita, Pola receives an opportunity to be a mother again, a gift she thinks she has lost for good. Pola's love for Chachita impulses a reactionary response from the community, eventually leading to the removal of the enslaved that betray their people, such as Leticia la Colaboradora and Celestina, who has albinism. Both women suffer illusions of grandeur, try to reject their community, and in the process suffer punishment. Leticia la Loca descends into madness due to societal rejection, and Celestina develops severe skin pigmentation disorders and is deported to a leprosarium. Through Pola's gifts of caring for Chachita, she carries on the tradition of liberation and healing. Weaver writes, quote, "Through divination and the manufacture and distribution of herbal remedies, charms, talismans, and potions, caperlatas carried on African healing traditions. Diviners occupied important places in Africa. They expressed, maintained, and validated the cultural truths of a society," end quote. Likewise, Pola's hands act as a healing agent for Chachita. They bring her food, safety, security, and eventual medicine when Rufina assists Pola in helping the girl escape to la Cueva del Cimarrón. While this is an act of survival, solidarity creates space for collective healing. Similarly, Matilde's hands act as agents of both change and gifts of life. In Daughters of the Stone, Llanos Figueroa documents the young girl's life, gifted and profoundly and emotionally tied to the earth and its manifestations. She writes, quote, as the years passed, the people of the Batey got used to Mati's odd ways. One day, as the women of Las Agujas were having their midday meal, Mati wandered toward the back of the choza. As she passed the pigsty, her eyes were drawn to the sounds of a pig surrounded by her litter. A tiny piglet lay ignored and immobile. Mati climbed over the lowest slat and crawled to the lone animal. She closed her eyes and concentrated on the inert animal on her lap. End quote. After this event, Margot is aware of her power and tells her, quote, you can do much good with your gift, but sometimes animals and people too are meant to die. Their time here is finished and they must leave us. The same power that gives you the gift gives all of us life. End quote. While Yemaya is the Orisha accompanying Kira on her healing journey in A Woman of Endurance, Lady Oshun tells Mati stories. She tells her of her mother Fela and, quote, Father Imo and her grandfather, the Keeper of Tales. She told Mati about the ancestors who would always be waiting, end quote. It is the same connection that she has with her mother Fela that helps Mati use her powers as Caperlata to free herself and take hold of the plantation. After Don Tomas tells her that she will be the owner of the plantation, ownership is removed from her as she is unable to read and write. While he tells her she will have everything, her fear becomes reality when other plantation owners assert their dominance over her and refuse to believe she is the daughter of Don Tomas. This erasure of her freedom leads her to use her powers to take ownership of what is hers. Llanos Figueroa writes, quote, one after the other, the neighboring plantation owners who had taken her land and developed ailments for which the doctors could find no explanation or remedy. Each man began to waste away. The gentry offered masses for the improvement of their health. Local doctors were replaced by specialists from the capital. The druggist made a fortune filling prescriptions that never worked. Lawyers were summoned, paraded in and out with ink-stained fingers and newly witnessed documents. Distraught wives were tortured by nightmares of hearses and shrouds of black silk. When the situation seemed hopeless, words were whispered in the dark. And then there would be a nocturnal knock on Mati's door. Soon after, a visit from Mati and an understanding. By the end of the year, every man who had stolen a parcel of her land would sign it back in exchange for her elixirs. The land she was given always coincided exactly with the land left to her in Don Tomas's will. She never asked for more or was given a kilometer more or less. Shortly thereafter, the ailing man's health would be improved and all would apparently be well. It would be years before anyone noticed that none of these patrones fathered any children after their mysterious illness, end quote. It is through this process that Mati gains her rightful land back and provides collective safe spaces for previously enslaved African people. Using her powers as Caperlata helps assert her place in society. She will then celebrate that this gift is carried on by her daughter Conchita, reminding readers that these gifts of healing and restoration continue across generations. This operatic inheritance, as I posit, moves from the maternal DNA, crossing generations and affirming solidarity in kinship. In Yomaira C. Figueroa Vasquez, Decolonizing Diasporas chapter titled Witnessing, Figueroa Vasquez writes the following, quote, as Audre Lorde reminds us in her poem, Sisters in Arms, one of the most important tasks we have in the battle against oppression is to fight side by side, documenting our dead behind us, and ushering in the possibilities of futurities beyond the death knell of colonialism through a ritual of healing, end quote. Paula and Mati use their healing powers to create spaces of healing and restoration in the two novels by Llanos Figueroa. These women act as agents of change and resistance by taking hold of their own lives and forging their own spaces of authority and leadership within their communities. In addition, they contributed to collective acts of resistance through healing, understanding the intimate relationship between life and death, and responding to kinship by emerging as leaders within their communities. Weaver documents that the caperlata refers to a magic charm and is still used amongst voodoo practitioners today. As an object of safety and cultural resilience, these charms represent the lives of Pola and Mati as women who learn to exercise their power to restore communal histories and step into their power as initiators of revolution and resistance. Thank you.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about the role of cooks and food as a tool of resistance, survival, and healing in Dalma Llanos Figueroa's A Woman of Endurance. A Woman of Endurance explores the experiences of enslaved Africans in colonial Puerto Rico and their resistance against oppression. The story focuses on the silent revolutionary roles in Hacienda Las Mercedes. One of the roles is the cook, crucial in nurturing the enslaved community and supporting their resistance efforts. The enslaved African women transported to the Caribbean during the transatlantic slave trade faced unimaginable hardships and struggles. They were subject to brutal forced labor, physical abuse, and sexual exploitation by their enslavers. In the novel, we read about where Paula came from and her hardships before she arrived at Hacienda Las Mercedes. However, amid these struggles, these women found ways to resist their oppressors and create a sense of community and cultural identity. One of the most effective forms of resistance was through their food and cooking practices. Silent resistance was prevalent among enslaved Africans who used their limited agency to resist their oppressors. An essay from the University of Miami, it says, passive resistance involves the following: slow working, pretending ignorance, and deliberate carelessness, much like silent quitting nowadays. If you change the slide, I want you guys to read with me Janice Virtue's quote in her article, An Even Stronger Woman, the Enslaved Black Caribbean Woman. It says, enslaved women took part in every important fight against slavery. Slave women courageously fought against the restrictive bonds of slavery. However, they did so in their distinctive ways. Historians have valorized the more often violent or forceful acts of resistance attributed to enslaved Black men. But women's individualized means of resistance to slavery, such as poisoning the master or family members, abortions, or infanticide, have too often been ignored. Next slide, please. Food has always been a central aspect of African culture. It's a means of sustenance and a source of cultural identity and social connection. The enslaved African women who arrived in the Caribbean brought their ethnic culinary traditions and skills. They used food to nourish their bodies, preserve their cultural heritage, and create a sense of community. You can change the slide now. In A Woman of Endurance, we find different forms of silent resistance, one of them being the cooks. The cooks were responsible for preparing food for the enslaved community and used this role to build solidarity and support among the enslaved people. They used food to unite the people, comfort those in distress, and support the resistance movement in any way. Female agency was also a critical theme in our novel. The cooks were predominantly women and used their agency to resist their oppressors and support their fellow enslaved people. In addition, they were responsible for maintaining their African ancestors' cultural practices and traditions. They used their cooking skills to preserve these traditions and pass them down to future generations. The enslavers in the Caribbean tried to strip the enslaved Africans of their cultural identity and force them to assimilate into European culture. However, enslaved African women resisted this assimilation by using their cooking practices as a form of resistance. They created dishes that reminded them of their homeland and used food to express their cultural identity. They also share their cultural traditions with other enslaved people, building community and solidarity. The enslaved women had no access to formal European education, property, and other forms of power. However, they could attain a certain agency level through their professionalism as chefs and cooking. By controlling the palates of their enslavers and knowing which ingredients, spices, viandas, herbs, to use for healing, they held some power over the enslavers and earned the love and trust of other enslaved. They became the ones who prepared the meals for their masters and were often responsible for feeding the entire plantation. Their role as cooks gave cocineras a sense of importance and an illusion of control over their lives. And the novel has a character named Pastora. And this character is an enslaved person in Puerto Rico who is the head cook of Hacienda Las Mercedes. Pastora is a skilled cook and uses her culinary expertise to resist her oppressors and maintain her cultural identity. Her enslaver highly valued Pastora's cooking skills, and she was responsible for preparing the meals for the plantation's owner families and guests. However, Pastora used her position as a cook to subtly resist her oppressors. She would add traditional African ingredients and flavor to her prepared meals, keeping her cultural identity alive and preserving her connection to her homeland. Pastora also used her cooking skills to provide sustenance and support to other enslaved people. She often gathered ingredients and prepared meals for her fellow enslaved, creating a sense of community and solidarity. And I quote this from the book. It says, she purposely overestimates the family portions, resulting in generous leftovers. These she sends out the kitchen back door to the enslaved community in the lower Batey. Also, this silent protester is much loved by her fellow enslaved because, and I quote, she makes sure the cooks who feed the workers get more than their share of leftovers and unwanted scraps from La Casa Grande, end quote. This act of generosity and care helped uplift the spirits of other enslaved people and gave them hope and resilience in the face of their oppressors. Pastora could resist her oppressors and maintain her cultural identity through her cooking skills. Her culinary expertise was a means of survival, asserting her agency and empowering herself and her enslaved companions. The character of Pastora served as a powerful example of how food and cooking practices becomes a tool for survival, resistance, and empowerment during slavery. Her boss, Doña Filo, considers her cook a treasure because her unique cooking skills rival those made by foreign dignitaries. Food and cooking practices played a significant role in the resistance and empowerment of enslaved African women in the Caribbean. Through their culinary traditions, they could resist assimilation, create a sense of community, and attain a certain power level and empower themselves as women. Today, the culinary traditions of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean continue to influence Caribbean cuisine and serve as a reminder of the resilience and strength of these women. Dalma Llanos Figueroa's novel highlights Cook's significant roles in the resistance efforts of enslaved Africans. Through their silent resistance, collective nurturing, and female agency, they contribute to their community survival and eventual liberation. Thank you very much.
Let's see.
You're muted.
I was muted. Okay. Effective resistance, we articulate, rises beyond physical freedom from chains and control. by surviving and outliving the brutality of slavery through African-derived medical, cultural, spiritual, gustatory, fashion, artisanal, linguistic, and social practices. The presentation examines these professions of the enslaved, that while they facilitated the smooth running of the slave haciendas in Puerto Rico, they also created total domination over the lives of the masters and mistresses, who depended entirely on them for existence. Thus, the masters lived in fear of the enslaved people's potential for occupational sabotage by destroying the plantation, causing an epidemic, etc., a violent rebellion, deception, or merely just by outliving the master. And in the presentations, the presenters have demonstrated beyond reason or beyond doubt that the women's roles on the plantations have outlived the master's roles. And that is why these days we talk about women as the custodians of the cultures. The next research that will link this research will be the Taino female contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation and a great beginning to this symposium. Now we have time for questions. So you can ask questions to any of the speakers. But I just want to commend this panel for an excellent, excellent, excellent coverage, sort of a panoramic coverage of this particular aspect of plantation life and of resistance and resistance to enslavement, but we're talking about something that goes beyond resistance, that goes into areas where we're not just resisting and caught inside of that oppositional dynamic, but actually assuming sovereignty and creating worlds beyond, outside of plantation life. So this is very, very exciting to me. But anyway, I'll stop talking and give you some chances to ask some questions from the very, very insightful about the very, very insightful presentations that we just heard. Is there somebody who has a question or a comment?
Well, I would recommend the audience to also read Esmeralda Santiago's Conquistadora, particularly from about page 159 to the end of the book, in which similar things are described in the novel in great detail. And sometimes I would say perhaps Llanos Figueroa is either responding to Conquistadora or expanding and actually now focusing completely on the roles of the enslaved African women.
Okay, well, I don't see any hands for questions, so I'm going to go ahead and ask one. I'm not familiar with this novel, but now, of course, that you've made this great presentation, I think I have to read it. We know that the things that you're speaking about didn't just apply to Puerto Rico. It applied to the whole Caribbean, but also to the whole Afro-Atlantic. So you have these long traditions of female resistance. Even resistance is too cheap a word, I think, to use here. It goes beyond resistance. But in any case, let's use resistance for now. And so there's a history of this that I think becomes part of traditions that are carried through the Afro-Atlantic by the enslaved. From the very, very earliest period of enslavement. at least enslavement under the paradigm of the European maritime expansion that begins in the 15th century. So there are other aspects of this as well, though, that I think we'll be talking about later on today, which have to do with the control by enslaved women of subsistence gardens and also weekend markets. So I'm just wondering if in that novel there was any mention made of those, because those are also some other traditions besides the ones that you mentioned that are crucial to the agency of enslaved women.
Yes, panelists, feel free to jump in.
The novel is a very interesting read, and we only focus on those roles, but in the novel you see different enslaved Africans work different types of jobs. For example, we had the field workers, which we didn't talk about, but in a sense they protected their community when a character in the novel basically betrayed them and basically told the master where the runaways were. And you see that sense of community and protecting themselves. Most of our research was done on, for example, on language of dress. That book focused on Jamaica. With our medical research, it was Saint Domingue. So we see that the Caribbean as a whole may have gone through what the novel is basically showing us or demonstrating.
Yes.
I also wanted to add that in the novel, like Leishla said, there are more jobs that the enslaved people were trusted with. Like, for example, after Simon was brutally beaten, he could not work in the field, but he was not thrown away. He was given a creative job. He was given the job of working with wood to make furniture for rich people. So like I feel like this novel brings up another kind of humanity that we don't see in other kind of neo slave narratives. Like we see that part of like you can be creative and be useful somewhere else, not just in the plantation. You are valuable for the gift that you bring.
Yeah, I think that brings up another really important point. A lot of people don't realize that these other jobs you've been making a very good case and giving us a very good picture of these other jobs that were allocated normally to people gendered as female. But we also, again, now that you just mentioned this, we have to, Caroline, we have to talk about those jobs that were allocated to people gendered as male as well. And in fact, most of these specialized jobs were given to men rather than to women. So the result was, in many cases, that the majority of the field workers were not male, they were female. This especially in the post-transition plantations. So the plantations before the transition to capitalism, that is the ones that were established early on by, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese, men are in the majority. But then after the transition to capitalism, under the Dutch and the British and the French, women become the major component of the field workers. And then, of course, once you get to Puerto Rico, you're getting to the second wave of plantation enslavement in Puerto Rico, which follows the Dutch, English, and French paradigm. So yes, these are all things that have been systematically erased, hidden, and or downplayed in the dominant historical narratives. And so these are all really, really important things that you're bringing out here. And a lot of our images of what a plantation looked like, and who was doing the work and who was doing what work and what the relations of power were, are totally, totally fictitious. They're just figments of the colonial imaginations and distortions of the colonial gaze.
Yeah, in Esmeralda Santiago's Conquistadora, there is a man, a carpenter and a carver. He makes beautiful artwork with wood, just as we have that in Daughters of the Stone, etc., etc. So there are definitely other areas that this research can expand to include, but we don't want the research to be too vast and nebulous. So we decided to focus on these 4 aspects. But as when we go back to the drawing board after this presentation, we might make cross references to some of these other. But reading through the 2 novels, A Woman of Stone and A Woman of Endurance, Daughters of the Stone and Woman of Endurance, we do not really see a focus on the maintenance of small gardens or time given to the enslaved communities to work their own gardens, and from those gardens selling a few things to gain their own money. But even feeding the masters from those gardens, the novel doesn't focus on that very much. So maybe we cannot prescribe what the author should have written, but we so yeah.
But one thing that does tie all of that together, though, even though there may not have been explicit mention of subsistence gardens and of those markets, those weekly markets, marketing in those weekend markets, those subsistence gardens are all life-seeking, life-giving activities, and I think that that's something that ties them together with all of the different characters that you mentioned. All of these people are healers or people who do things that create and support life. And so again, this is such a sovereign, such a powerful statement of sovereignty, because if you're living in such a death-seeking system as plantation enslavement, by its very nature, by its very definition, it seeks death.
Yes.
It seeks money, and of course, money. Marx said money is dead labor. So it's all death-seeking. And here you have people who manage, women especially, who manage within a death-seeking system to create life. And so to me, that's more than even resistance. That's establishing another world, a world that's defined by death, and then establishing another world that's defined by life. That's resistance plus. It's actually imagining a new way of being in the world that goes way, way beyond resistance in terms of the challenge that it poses to the dominant system. Any more questions? Professor Stancic, did you have a question? Did I see a question there?
She had indicated I preempted her question.
It was the same question that Donovan quickly answered.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm especially pleased because the second book just came out last month. So I'm very grateful to be able to hear about the second book of hers that I haven't read yet, that I have on my summer reading list. So excellent, excellent presentation.
Another thing that, thank you, Professor Stancic. Another thing that, another interesting part of this is the fact that you wrote about seamstresses. And again, weaving all cloth making, all of those skills are really, really interesting to me because there is in life-giving activities, life is created, and that power, that sovereign power to create life, is so wonderfully represented by cloth, because again, you have these individual strings going all these different directions, and then all of a sudden you have this wonderful fabric. And there are lots of different metaphors that apply here, like matrix. So in other words, when in Western science and linguistics, we always think of monocausality, everything has one cause. But actually, when you think of a cloth, where is it's rhizomatic, the threads are going in different directions, yet something is created from that. And I think that, again, when we think about language, of course, when the whole definition of text, or the word text, comes from that very root, cloth. And so again, sovereignty as expressed through these life-giving activities, sovereignty as expressed through how we create things like cloth, but also how we create things like language, and the kind of sovereign power that we can have with and over language, again, gets us to a sort of meta level of just the wonderful way that this particular author has been able to create this wonderful text and deftly weave all of the threads together to make it a living thing, to create a living text. And of course, I think that your analysis, your collective analysis, or your collective understanding of that text has taken that life that the text has to ever more wonderful levels. So thank you very, very much to this panel.
Thank you.
Okay, it's now 12:15. We're about 15 minutes over time. I would like to, I see that we have some people that should be presenting in the second presentation who are not here. So I would like to ask if either Deli or Gabriel, who are the 5th and 6th presentations, would like to go ahead now in this slot while we're waiting for the others to come. If you don't, that's fine if you're not ready to present yet. But I'm just wondering, Deli, would that be okay?
I can do it.
You can do it, Gabriel? Excellent. Yes. Okay, so let's go to the presentation that was supposed to be the last one. And make that the second one. I'm going to project it on the screen now. I'm sorry about this change, but unfortunately, some of the people who are supposed to be presenting today have just moved from Puerto Rico, physically moved from Puerto Rico to St. Croix, and they may be having problems connecting from where they are in St. Croix. So let's go ahead with this. Yes, okay, so our second presentation is titled Linguistic Landscapes in the Afro-Atlantic, the Public Representation of People of African Descent in Puerto Rico, and this will be presented by Gabriel Suarez.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm using both my cell phone and my computer, so I don't even see my ugly face, but that's fine. As Professor Dr. Faraklas just mentioned, the title of my presentation, I should start with my name also. My name is Gabriel Suarez, and the title of my presentation is Linguistic Landscapes in the Afro-Atlantic, the Public Representation of People of African Descent in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Today, we consider the public representation of people of African descent in the Afro-Atlantic in general, and in Puerto Rico in particular, from a multimodal critical discourse analysis perspective. Puerto Rico is a particularly interesting case because, number one, during the first 350 years of its colonial history, the majority of the island's inhabitants were of African descent, while during the following 170 years of its colonial history, conscious policies of whitening the island by promoting immigration from Europe have been adopted first by the Spanish colonizers and then by the US colonizers. While, as is the case, go back. Number two, while, as is the case with many other islands of the Caribbean, Puerto Rico is still a colony in the older sense of the word. Over the past decade, it has also become a neo-colony under a regime of structural adjustment imposed by the US banks, similar to the regimes that have been imposed by the World Bank, IMF, WTO, on the so-called independent nations of Africa and the Americas. Responding to Bakhtin's critiques of the study of discourse for its failure to acknowledge the dialectal, the dialogical, and dialectical aspects of language as a point of departure, I adopt a decolonial approach to unpacking how linguistic landscapes depict African-descended people, both geographically across the Afro-Atlantic as well as temporally across colonial and neo-colonial paradigms of domination. The past decade has witnessed a rapidly growing body of scholarly work focused on the dialectical and mutually co-constitutive relationship between discourse on the one hand and the categories that enable systems of domination such as race and gender on the other. It has been convincingly demonstrated that while racism racializes people and their discourse, people and their discourse also language race, and that where one process begins and the other ends is an impossible question to answer. Some of the most recent work on the complicated relationships between race and discourse can be found in Aline, Reyes, and Cross-Treaty, who demonstrate the need for linguists and others to question and upend existing understandings of the relationships between categories such as language, identity, ethnicity, and race. Within a racial-linguistic framework, one strategy that they recommend for doing this is, quote, viewing race through the lens of language and language through the lens of race to better understand them as co-constitutive processes, because race is created out of continuous and repeated discourses emerging from individuals and institutions within political economic systems and everyday interactions. This new approach has relevance for the Afro-Atlantic in general and in Puerto Rico in particular, because, as Paraclas and Delgado point out, the Afro-Atlantic played a central role in the emergence of the racialization of modern Western societies as Align et al. Add, their, quote, histories of genocide, enslavement, apartheid, occupation, dispossession, nationalism, capitalism, and various forms of colonialism, as well as their contemporary manifestations. Rosa and Flores promote, quote, a racial-linguistic perspective which interrogates the historical and contemporary co-naturalization of language and race by highlighting how, quote, racial linguistics ideologies that organize colonial relations continue to shape the world order in the post-colonial era by framing racialized subjects' language practices as inadequate for complex thinking processes needed to navigate the global economy on the one hand, and as targets of anxieties about authenticity and purity on the other. Another one is Uscioli, I should say, argues that, quote, racialization as it now exists spread throughout the world over the last 2 to 3 centuries as a modernity project, end of the quote. As will be demonstrated in the following slides, this has particular repercussions in relation to the presentation and the larger dissertation project in which it is based, which is focused on how, quote, racializing discourses emerge in popular media such as advertising. This billboard centers on the image of a woman of Africa. Please go back to the picture. This billboard centers on the image of a woman of African Caribbean descent alongside an image of the trademark for a product named Suave, which is associated with similar words in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French that can be used to describe persons and hair which are smooth as opposed to coarse in their presentation, as well as to refer to persons and hair which pass, that is, which present themselves in such a way that they are maximally acceptable under the norms established by the dominant discourses of racialized societies. This product has been used for decades by African-descended women and to a lesser extent by African-descended men to straighten the curly hair associated with the phenotypical features stereotypically associated with people raised as Black by the discursive binary plus minus white, around which the racialization of societies in the Americas and eventually the rest of the Afro-Atlantic has taken place. The use of the tag hashtag #hairpowerment at the very beginning of the text gives notice to us that we can access much more information about the product with a few taps of our fingers on our devices, while the same tag notifies us that no more information is available regarding the woman depicted in the center of the billboard, whose personhood is effectively erased and enclosed by the seductive messaging. By incorporating the abbreviated form "powerment" from the term empowerment, the tag itself immediately sets in motion a series of associations that relied on dominant mental models, social representations, and ideologies that center around discourses of domination that involve racialization of individuals and societies, as well as discourses of resistance to domination. The trademark is situated above her to the left, and an image of a bottle of the actual product is to be found below her to the right, as if she's enclosed in a set of parentheses. This configuration of images suggests that the product is defending her persona and social face, not only from external threats that may be aimed at her from one side or the other, but also from internal threats and insecurities associated with being positioned as minus white and minus male. The question arises as to whether this particular product is acting as an all-encompassing shield to defend and protect her, or, on the contrary, as an all-encompassing set of prison bars to entangle her ever more deeply in a destructive spiral of self-rejection and denial that fuels ever more desperate and ever more pointless attempts to conform to a set of artificial and unattainable norms that were created not in her image and interests, but instead in the image and interests of ethnocentric, racial, and patriarchal domination. But this question is immediately answered by the slogan at the bottom of the billboard, which leads with the words "suave," means disentangling, relaxing your curls, and disentangling, relaxing your insecurities. The messaging on the billboard is one that stresses the possibility of relief from insecurities about hair texture experienced by people, especially women, who are raised as Black in Puerto Rico and beyond through processes of disentanglement and relaxing designed to assist people who are raised as Black with relatively lighter skin in passing for white, and those with relatively darker skin to demonstrate to the world that they are at least trying to pass by rejecting the stereotypical features associated with people raised as minus white and trying to conform to the dominant norms of beauty defined by the stereotypical features associated with people raised as plus white. The irony and deception encapsulated in this slogan, where terms associated with liberation and empowerment are deployed to legitimize and celebrate the re-enslavement of the people of the Afro-Atlantic, in particular, African-descended women, to racially defined norms of beauty that fetishize, I should say, physical features associated with stereotypes of people who are raised as plus white has become the rule rather than the exception in public discourse in the present era of ascendant fascism and rabid disinformation via the social media. Thank you very much. This is the list of my references, and thanks again.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. Now we will take questions. I'll project the billboard while we do the questions so that you can make reference to it if you like. Any questions from the audience or other presenters or comments? I see that our colleagues in St. Croix are here with us now, so we'll be able to continue with the schedule after this one, after this presentation. So we'll go back to number 2 after this one, which was originally numbered number 6. But so you can relax, Delhi. You can stay closer to the position you were originally on in the program. But in any case, questions about this presentation?
Question, Gabrielle, is it possible
I have
to,
an answer.
yes, is it possible to also look at the idea of this tangling or disentanglement from a very ironic position? You can disentangle from whiteness, even though it's meant that your hair will no longer be difficult. You will then have pelo bueno, not pelo malo, etc., etc. So can one talk about this disentanglement from different positions? You disentangle from blackness and curly hairness to straightness and moving towards whiteness. But in disentangling, you are disentangling from yourself. But you disentangle to become entangled, as you have said. But I'm trying to say, okay, can't one also use the same products to disentangle from whiteness? And look, my hair can be curly today, it can be straight tomorrow, and it can be curly tomorrow again. And I'm not going to be entangled by any category.
There was no question, right? You were just commenting.
Yeah, I'm just making a statement.
Also, yeah, we were.
Statement question.
Yesterday, while I was talking to Professor Dr. Faraklas, we also had somehow this conversation also. I don't know if this is your direction, because again, those are your eyes, and I'm talking from my eyes, and there's a lot of perceptions here, right? It's what you perceive, right?
Yes, yes.
But I agree, and also the this disentanglement, it might be some sort of external force that is, yeah, not only making her hair bueno, it's somehow avoiding resistance to the system, you know. So now you're soft, you become a passive entity that is going to just deal with the system and flow with the system instead of resistant. I don't know if I'm echoing what you just said, would you like to say something else?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking of survival within resistance, or resistance within survival.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there are a lot of there are many intersections in this picture, and the more that I see it, as I was telling Professor Paraclas, the more that you are going to find out about it in such a what looks like a simple picture, because also she's wearing a what we call a white t-shirt, and that also catches my attention.
Well, but the t-shirt is imprisoned between a black head top and then a black skirt or trousers or whatever. And then, yes, and out of the white t-shirts project arms and neck and the rest of the body that are not white. So
Yes, also we were talking about those two, the arms. I don't know if I have time, but I also mentioned, I don't know if you remember, there was a picture in during World War II, I think, when woman was asked to work. Yes. And you know that with the muscle in her arm, but here is not, there's no strength in this woman. She's just, her strength has gone all to the bottle.
Yes, I think that picture was the picture of Rosie the Riveter from World War II, when when women were asked to work more, not only to do all the work that they already were doing that is never even acknowledged or compensated, but also to actually get into the factories and start riveting parts for ships and airplanes. Yes, so that's a very interesting comparison that you make there. But also, getting back to Professor Kuobang's point, I think that this ties in very, very well with the next presentation, which is about a trans approach to decolonial understandings. And I think that we've been talking about a new trans perspective, which complicates, entangles, and when all of our discussions about resistance, etc. So these trans performances that I think Professor Kuobang was making reference to here. So maybe with this product, you can accomplish all kinds of trans performances where one day your hair is entangled, the next day your hair is straight, the next day your hair is entangled. And so it allows a repertoire of performances that that can actually be very effective in terms of resistance, etc. But that they're effective because they're entangled in ingenious ways, and they're working at many different levels, and also they're projecting many different voices at the same time. So again, this leads us into the next presentation, which is focused on that trans performativity. More questions, comments about this presentation. Yes. So in that case, I'd like to congratulate Gabriel Suarez for an excellent presentation. And let's move on to the next one. Okay, can everybody see it?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So good afternoon. This presentation is titled LGBTQIA2S+ Translocations and Superpositions across Afro-Atlantic and Afro-Indian zones of contact, colonization, criminalization, captivity, and contestation. This presentation was put together by a group of students and professors from the Universidad de Puerto Rico, and also from Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. This presentation is also dedicated to the life and work of Edwin Chiloba. Just a warning, there's mention of violence in this presentation.
The realities of trans people are driven by their own agency in relation to competing discourses of oppression and empowerment, as shown in the case studies included in the following slides of Groupie D from Brazil and Yvonne from Venezuela, two Afro-Caribbean trans people.
Also, you'll be there's a third person who will be considering here, who is Mena.
At about the age of 17, Groupie decided to change her name from David G, the name that her mother imposed, to Mariana, a name that would better reflect the other side of the dualistic identities of heteronormativity. Groupie's mother now calls her Mariana and considers her to be a daughter. After years of discrimination while Bolsonaro, fascism, and anti-trans sentiment were on the rise in Brazil, Groupie realized that Mariana was suffering and was not prepared for what was coming, so she needed a change of identity to take charge of the course of her life.
For these reasons, Mariana abandoned her name and adopted Groupie D, a name that represented an act of rebellion and movement across time and space, from Brazil to Barcelona, but also a name that will maintain a connection with her mother through the initial D for David. She also understands that in each identity phase, names must be changed, and therefore plans to change her name again in her constant effort to free herself from dominant discourses and oppressive socio-political realities. Assigned the name Rennie at her birth in a homophobic environment on the Caribbean coast of Venezuela, Yvonne is a 43-year-old trans woman who uses the pronoun she. Seeking a less hostile place to live, Rennie decided to move to the Canary Islands, and although she still did not have any trans points of reference there, she decided to begin her name change from Rennie to Yvonne. Yvonne then moved to Barcelona, where she fully assumed her trans feminine identity, and she has not returned to Venezuela to visit her mother, who still sees her as a son and denies her trans identity. Yvonne sees herself as having transitioned so as to possess the stereotypical heteronormative characteristic of female gender, thus allowing her to pass. Nevertheless, Yvonne feels that as a trans woman, she will never be a woman. Here she uses the term trans to emphasize what is not, and to express a powerful agency by which she has assumed sovereignty over her body.
In the words of Sobunfo Some, a Ghanaian Dagara woman, the words gay and lesbian do not exist in the village, but there is a word gatekeeper that applies to LGBTQ plus individuals who live a life at the edge between the world of the village and the world of the spirit. Everybody respects them because without gatekeepers, there's no access to other worlds. Most people in the West define themselves and others by sexual orientation. In the village, homosexuality is seen very differently than it is seen in the West, in part because all sexuality is spiritually based. Taken away from its spiritual context, it becomes a source of controversy and can be exploited. The propagation of anti-LGBTQ plus discourses in the Anglophone countries of Africa and the Caribbean has little to do with any so-called authentic African or Caribbean pre-colonial traditions that many of its proponents claim to be defending. Such anti-LGBTQ plus discourses instead have everything to do with the devastating cis heterosexist legacy of British colonialism and the ever-rising tide of US neocolonial hegemony, spearheaded today by politicians like Trump and the rest of the Republican Party and the racist, cis heterosexist, fundamentalist Christian supporters. The evidence that repressive anti-LGBTQ plus laws are a colonial legacy is clear. Almost all such laws are exclusively found in former British colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, while anti-LGBTQ plus criminalization laws are virtually absent in the former Spanish, French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonies.
Okay, so looking at this map of sub-Saharan Africa, all the spots in red and orange are the places where there are very, very repressive anti-LGBTQ plus laws. And these are all almost invariably countries that were former British colonies, with one or two exceptions. And the countries in green are the ones that have none of these repressive anti-LGBTQ plus laws. And these are all countries with almost without exception that were colonized by other colonial powers rather than the British. The same is true in Latin America and the Caribbean. All of those red and orange spots where you have repressive laws against non-cis heteronormative people are former British colonies, whereas all of the green ones are almost invariably, that is green because they are free of these repressive laws, are almost invariably places that were not colonized by the British.
As openly gay people since the 1970s and as a married interracial couple for the past decade, 2 members of our team arrived in Bamburi Beach in Kenya in November of 2022. Those who we met along the East African coast invariably treated us with respect as 2 men who had bonded with each other into a relationship that almost everyone found most appropriate to refer to as one of brothers. At the same time, just days after we left Kenya, LGBTQ plus campaigner Edwin Chiloba was murdered and his body was left in a metal box at the side of a road along the border with neighboring Uganda.
In March 2023, the Ugandan parliament passed a law which makes it illegal for anyone to even identify themselves as LGBTQ+. Walker states that before and after independence, homosexuality was illegal in Uganda under British colonial laws, but nobody was ever arrested or prosecuted, and homosexuality was not a political issue. That changed in 2009 when a group of American fundamentalist evangelicals led by Pastor Scott Lively held a series of talks in Uganda, including a 5-hour speech in front of the Ugandan parliament. Shortly after Mr. Lively's visit, Ugandan MP David Bahati introduced the Ugandan anti-homosexuality bill, which included the death penalty. Mr. Bahati is a member of The Family, a secretive right-wing fundamentalist Christian group based in Washington, D.C. that has close links to former President Trump and former Vice President Pence in the US, as well as with Ugandan President Museveni. Among the American fundamentalist Christians in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa is the US-based International House of Prayer, which has more than 1,000 employees promoting anti-LGBTQ+ campaigns and a reported annual budget of some $30 million US. Their influence has resulted in the terrorization of African LGBTQ+ people. For example, in January 2014, then Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan signed his country's anti-gay bill into law.
While fundamentalist Christians are terrorizing LGBTQ+ people in Africa and the Caribbean, they are also terrorizing LGBTQ+ people in Europe and in the US. In March 2022, Florida Republican Governor DeSantis signed the Don't Say Gay bill into law, prohibiting any instruction and discussion of either sexual orientation or gender identity in schools. Similar laws are being passed elsewhere in the US, which will lead to increased rates of LGBTQ+ youth suicides. 49 LGBTQIA2S+ people were killed by a Muslim fundamentalist mass shooter at the Pulse nightclub in Florida, USA, on the 12th of June, 2016. Almost all of the victims were of African and Afro-Caribbean descent. Since the Orlando shootings, there have been many more, including the massacre at Club Q in Colorado Springs, USA in November 2022, in which 5 people were murdered by a self-declared neo-Nazi white nationalist. Fascist-leaning cable news companies such as Fox News, which have a larger audience than any other networks in the US, have reacted to such shootings with language designed to legitimize and license more anti-LGBTQ+ violence and terror. For example, Jenna Ellis, one of Trump's former lawyers and the host of the Jenna Ellis Show on Newsmax Network, said that the real tragedy was not that people were murdered at Club Q, but instead that the victims were probably not Christians and therefore would be burning in hell.
Back to Bamburi Beach in Kenya, although there was a lively sex trade along the beach later in the day, early in the morning, the beach became the setting for more radical, less commercially defined, and less hegemonically enclosed trans performances. As the sun rose each day, the people walking on the beach included a fascinating and gender-bending series of trans performers who unassumingly yet audaciously went about their daily business. A gender-neutral jogger, a mustached Don Juan-like figure in flowing multicolored scarves and robes, a fully beaded and bearded sultana, etc. In contrast to the more commercial performances that predominated later on in the day, none of these trans performers seemed to be soliciting anything, and none seemed to be trying to make a point. And maybe making a point, or at least the need to make a point, is partly what is at stake here.
Long before the two of us were married, both of us had been part of the social and political movements of the 1960s and 1970s, including the movements for LGBTQ+ rights, such as some of the first demonstrations demanding that non-cis heteronormative people come out of the closet and into the streets, the first gay pride parades, etc. When we find ourselves in places such as Kenya, which many in the global north consider to be non-gay friendly places, we always stand back to take a critical look at what we mean when we say gay and friendly. If the global north is so friendly, why is Bamburi so full of lonely northerners looking to connect with someone? And why should it be assumed that the ways in which people in the global north construct such binaries as straight versus gay, married versus single, and in versus out of the closet are somehow universal, and therefore must also be those by which the people who live by Bamburi Beach interpret and articulate their world?
Do such conceptual bases really reflect the diverse ways in which humans have understood and celebrated our sexuality and genderings over our entire 300,000 years on Earth? Or are they an artifact of the hegemonic colonizations of our minds, which has taken place alongside the relatively recent rise of systems of domination over the past few thousand years? While our struggles against cis heteronormativity certainly have been necessary to begin to undo that colonizations in the context of the global West, when do we move beyond questions of rights to more fundamental questions of our very real and essential sovereign powers in relation to our sexualities and genderings? Questions which many in the global South may be in a somewhat better position to help us address.
Maybe the plus at the end of LGBTQIA2S+ should be best read not as an afterthought of little bits and pieces that are left over. Perhaps this plus represents the 95% of human sexualities and gender performances that hegemonic conceptual boxes could never ever enclose, and that Western ways of understanding the world do not give themselves permission to see, much less to come to terms with or to celebrate. There is ample evidence of all kinds of non-cis heterosexualities and gender performances in every human society at every period of human history before the extremely recent consolidation of cis heteronormativity and the institution. And the institution to enforce it, such as the nuclear family and anti-LGBTQ+ laws. People everywhere enjoy the kind of bonding that the two of us have enjoyed as gay marriage couple.
They probably have done so. However, as what they might have understood to be something like brother and brother, rather than a husband and husband. In fact, most places and times, eroticism, affection, and bonding into deep relationships have been just as likely to take place between people sex as male and male or female and female than between people sex as male and female. And for most of its relatively short history, institutionalized marriage has been more about fulfilling social obligations than about eroticism, affection, and bonding. So when our colleagues from the Global South express discomfort with the idea of gay marriage, this should be seen more as an opportunity for opening up conversations about how such erotic, affectionate, non-cis heteronormative bonding happened and was talked about before and after the encroachment of patriarchal religions and associated hegemonic institutions, rather than yet another opportunity to make a homo-hegemonic point, whereby white, queer liberalism serves as neo-colonizing function by instructing global South and third world countries on the right way to be queer.
Mena is a Puerto Rican trans non-binary artist and linguist. In the last 3 years, they have been learning the languages of bomba and ballroom. Ballroom is an art form created by Black and brown trans women in New York, and bomba is a music art form created by Afro-Puerto Rican ancestors. So how does a non-Black Puerto Rican find their place in two art forms created by Black ancestors? Transness, Mena's intersections of gender, class, race, etc., allow them to tap into the vast liminal space of trans performance. Through ballroom categories, they interpret a version of themselves that is confident, extravagant, excessive, composed. Through bomba dance, they embody intention, wordless expression, and connect with the self and the batey, the place where bomba happens, but also the entire gathering. Both gift Mena the power to embody narratives that transcend prescribed parameters, and this is where Mena assumes a pro-trans and pro-Black narrative of social responsibility. Each new ball and batey becomes an opportunity to embody performances of sovereignty, and Mena understands just how much of what gives them this power is directly traceable to African and indigenous influence in their world. A context, be it a person or place, cannot contain something without being changed by it. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. My congratulations to all the co-presenters. It was on a great performance. Okay, now we're opening this up to questions. Any questions or comments from the audience? Well, just to tie it in with Professor Kouabong's last comment from the former presentation, again, we're focusing on transness here and talking about transness not just in terms of the norms and binary oppositions upon which patriarchy operates, but also the norms and oppositions upon which ethnocentrism and racism operates, also plunder and capitalism operate, and also upon which anthropocentrism operates. So again, it's a lot of entanglements. So I guess today we're celebrating entanglements, right, Professor Kouabong? We need to hear you, Professor Kouabong, you're muted.
That's what entanglement means. I don't know when to unmute and when to mute. Yeah, I was just saying yes, because we are connecting from so many different locations. And I don't know whether it's a question or an observation or just a thought that at the beginning, Sabonfo Summer and the spirit of intimacy is cited, where she talks about gay sexuality as a spiritual position, in which the warring factions of males and females are kind of united in a way. So if we take her position as that of spirituality, and she talks about the Dagara village in Dano in Burkina Faso, that the gay or lesbian or other non-heteronormative sexuality, it's not politicizing eroticism. It's not politicizing sex. It's not a display of sexuality on the body, etc., etc. But that they have. Don't you think her position can also be limiting, that the gay person or the lesbian or the trans person is only limited as a bridge? They perform the role of being the bridge or being the peacemaker, not for themselves, but to harmonize, to bring about peace, peaceful coexistence in the community. So in the way she's saying, they then sacrifice their purpose, or no, they sacrifice their own sexuality or sexual desires, because that is not the purpose for which they are created or they come into the world. Because if you read her other book, which is Welcoming Spirits Home, the person born, you have a purpose when you are coming to this earth. Spiritually, it's a spirit finding the ritual space between man and woman. And therefore, you may be born gay, but your purpose is not to enjoy your own sexuality, but to be an example of how the two sexes can actually function. So that's, I don't know whether I'm rambling on or thinking, because
no, I think that yeah, there's one way to interpret that. That's one way to interpret her words, and I think that but before we even mention that, though, we should mention the fact that the 2S in LGBTQI2S is something that's taken from the indigenous America. So 2S, two-spirited. And this again reflects the same idea that you were bringing out there, Professor Kouabon, about this person who has two spirits in them, and that in one sense, because both of the spirits are there, they're neither performing one or the other, they're doing both. But from another sense, because of the way that those individual gendered performances are valued in society, and those individually assigned sexes, male, female, are valued in society, this person is denied being able to perform one or the other. That's true. But again, I think that that the fact that here we have a gatekeeper that's between two worlds, and then when talking about two-spirited people, they're also seen as between two worlds, that these particular individuals play in many ways the same roles as the curanderas that you were mentioning in your first presentation. So people come to them for advice, people come to them for healing, so that again, these people are more than just two-spirited, they're more than just gatekeepers. They do have a very specific role to play, and a very life-giving role to play in their societies, so that I wouldn't see it as maybe being deprived of their own place or their own role, but actually as having a very special role and a very life-giving role. These are all different ways to read this positioning. But again, I can see where you're coming from, Professor Kouabon, because again, when we're talking about the curanderas, they're on a plantation. In other words, they're within a system that's really puts very severe constraints on their roles and positions them in a very particular way. And we could say this as well about many societies in West Africa. Also, we could say this about many indigenous societies in the Americas, that these were not and are not societies without patriarchy. These societies, again, as virtually all societies in the world for the last 10,000 years, not for all of human history, but at least for the last 10,000 years, have been infected to one degree or another by the virus of patriarchy, some more than others. So you could argue that in the indigenous Americas, societies may have been infected less than, say, places in sub-Saharan Africa, and in turn, places in sub-Saharan Africa could be said to have been infected less than in Western Europe and what's called the global West. But in any case, patriarchy has a long but finite heritage. What we're arguing here is that while humans have been on the earth for 300,000 years at least as Homo sapiens, these systems have only been around for the last 10,000 years or so. But they have definitely done a lot of damage in a lot of societies, and they position people in all kinds of very uncomfortable ways and death-seeking ways. But within all of that, people find these wonderful ways to seek life and actually perform roles and do performances that actually seek and celebrate life. So I think that's one way to look at it, and also I think is another way, another one of the many readings that we can give to Sobonfo Some's words.
Sí, y yo, Nicolás, ¿me escucho?
Sí, adelante.
Que yo creo que algo que bien importante añadir a eso, que mencionaste que muchas veces las asignaciones que se le dan a las personas trans o LGBTQI son como quizás fijas, pero también depende en el momento y el espacio en que esa característica o esa categoría esa persona tenga que vivirla. Y yo creo que es bien importante marcar como el tránsito que tiene esa persona en el tiempo y en el espacio y cómo puede adaptarse según sus contextos, ya sea como curandere o como gatekeeper, que yo creo que una de las cosas que se puede señalar aquí que conecta con las presentaciones es como que el cambio. Y lo importante de como que saber que puedes cambiar, and you have the power to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Excellent, yes. So again, this trans perspective is one that has been so helpful in my process of actually trying to decolonize my approach to the study of language. And I think it also is very helpful in decolonizing approaches to the study of literature, to not think of identities as monolithic. And that this idea of speaking of identity in the singular rather than the plural, this is what I think Swan is emphasizing here, is that in fact, for most of human history, people didn't think of identity in the singular. They thought of it in the plural. People were pluri-identified, pluricultural, pluriethnic, plurilingual. And so again, trans becomes the norm rather than the exception. And I think that insight really helps us to understand much, much more of what the majority of human history was like on this planet, where people were not being forced into these very, very limited, simplistic kind of straitjackets in terms of identities, their languages, their cultures, their ethnicities. And so I think that this whole trans approach to decolonizing our study of language actually is one that helps us make sense and come to terms with a lot more of our realities and the realities that our ancestors lived, and also the possibilities for the future, opening up many more doors in all of those different aspects of what it means to be a human being on the earth. Anyway, any more questions on this presentation?
Okay, another suggestion, or maybe, okay. I looked at the map. It's something I've raised. There's something that I keep raising. The map of where you have the red, the green, the yellow, the orange, and whatnot. And then we do we run the risk of glossing over the cultural aspects of communities and blaming everything on a colonial system, a colonial legal system, whether it's more punitive by British or less punitive by the French, even though the French Catholic tradition is equally as horrible towards the trans communities and so on. I mean, if you look at the Catholic teaching or the Spanish, the Inquisitions and all those other histories. What I'm trying to get at is if you look at Senegal or Mali or Niger or the French West Africa or North Africa, is it possible that we kind of limiting just our focus on a legal framework brought by colonization? We are kind of saying that the indigenous communities had no agency, no punitive measures, etc., no kind of resistance to trans. Two, what about Islam in these areas?
Yes.
Do we gloss over Islam completely and just blame everything on British laws,
No,
etc., or we need to actually say something briefly, even if it's very brief, so that those listening or reading will say, hey, wait a minute. What about the cultural readings of what it means to be trans?
Yes. No, we here we're talking specifically about laws,
Okay.
legal frameworks, and so so basically the point that you made that in Catholicism there is this this teaching that's very anti-LGBTQI, that even makes this map more dramatic, because in spite of the fact that the French were Catholic and the Portuguese were Catholic, these laws are not there. So in other words, this particularly viral form of institutionalized anti-LGBTQI plus legislation that involves the death penalty, okay, is defended by people in Africa and the Caribbean, by politicians especially, who are trying to be very populist, as our tradition. Yes, these laws are our tradition, and you'll find people saying that yes, the government of the United States is forcing us to betray our traditions by discouraging us from passing these very anti-LGBTQI laws, because so you have all that discourse. And so, in other words, these particular laws we're focusing in on are not part of any tradition here. Now, when we're talking about patriarchy, again, like I said about a little while ago, patriarchy is not something new to either sub-Saharan Africa or the Caribbean in terms of even pre-colonial times. Okay, and you have waves of colonization. So you can see Islam as a wave of colonization, a pre-European wave of colonization of West Africa and North and West Africa and parts of East Africa as well. So yes, and that colonization is just as entangled. No, but yes, it's pernicious. Yes, it has a side to it that could have been very anti-LGBTQI plus, but just like in the Caribbean, you had all kinds of resistance. So, for example, the kind of Islam that took hold in most of Africa is Sufism, which actually many of the orders of Sufism were founded by LGBTQI plus people who embodied this two-spiritedness. So in other words, what kind of Islam was adopted in West Africa? And you could, so anyway, it gets really complicated and entangled, which is wonderful because that's the way things should be. Human beings are complicated and entangled people. But I don't disagree with you though, that you have these patriarchal traditions, and some of which had anti-LGBTQI plus elements in them. But the all-sided legalization, the absolute legalization, and legislation that actually involves death penalty, I think it's very, and then having that legislation being promoted and defended by politicians all across Africa, who are saying that they're defending their authentic, so this idea of this kind of myth of authentic African authenticity, but at the same time, they're members of these fundamentalist Christian organizations, which are the most hyper-colonial organizations. So really what they're doing, they're defending neo-colonial and colonial institutions in using the guise of masquerading themselves as defenders of African tradition. So that's really what necessitated these maps, because the discourse is so rapidly based on something, this fictitious understanding of what some kind of authentic African tradition is, using that as the justification for these these are really hyper-fascist, hyper-colonial, hyper-neo-colonial, hyper-patriarchal, ethnocentric too, because there is these people in these organizations, these fundamentalist Christian organizations, are also incredibly racist. So again, it's just that it was focusing on that particular area. But again, all of this is extremely complicated, and that's and complex and entangled. Unfortunately, we have no more time. But
well, just to tell the presenters, great job. I'm just a spoiler, so don't.
No. No, this is very, very important.
Great
points.
job.
Very, very important points.
Yeah.
And of course we have other slides. We had to eliminate like so many slides, and there were other slides that talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Again, because of the constraints of time, we couldn't. Any case, let me get this up on the screen. Oops. Our next presentation was originally number 3, but now it's number 4 because of the fact that some of our participants are in St. Croix now, and they may have had some technical difficulties getting into the meeting, but they're all here now. So our next presentation is called Longue Durée, Durée Profonde, and Decolonial Linguistics in Africa and Beyond. We make the road by walking. This presentation was put together as well by a team of students and professors from Universidad de Puerto Rico and Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona.
Wandering and wondering along the transitional liminal zones of contact and contingency between the landmass of Eastern Africa and the Indian Ocean, it becomes difficult to ignore the fact that longue durée must be thought of in terms of both time and space. Stretching all the way to the shores of the Americas across Afro-Atlantic to the west, and all the way to the shores of the Americas across the Indo-Pacific to the east, deep connections, which also embody disruptions, defy the linear, artificially constrained, hierarchical, monolithic, monodirectional, and monocausal assumptions that underpin the colonial gaze of Western science in general, Western linguistics in particular.
Our Western linguistics perpetuates the colonial gaze through our privileging of a dead, monolithic, idealized language competence over multiplex, real, living, parole performance, through our obsession with abstract Eurocentric notions about language masquerading as universals, and through our mission to impose a colonizing order and control over otherwise indeterminate configurations of repertoires by erecting non-existent boundaries between artificially reified individual languages and by even more dubious extension between corresponding and equally artificially reified individual cultures, ethnicities, identities, etc. Up until now, most of those who have adopted a perspective that takes into account longue durée have argued that we must begin to consider historical context and influences which extend hundreds of years further into the past than is normally the case. In this contribution, we argue that it is only when we radically extend our notions of longue durée from only hundreds of years to several hundreds of thousands of years into the past that we can start to make real sense of out of the present and begin to envision fulfilling futures for all.
As human beings, we have been wandering and wandering over both land and water on this planet for at least 300,000 years, but it's only been the past 10,000 years or so, and beginning only in a few societies, that we've gotten stuck. But what does it mean to get stuck? When we turned our backs on wandering, we started to cling to addictive and death-seeking illusions of control, stability, and ownership of territory and goods.
When we turned our backs on wondering, instead of continuing to embrace and engage with the world with boundless life-seeking curiosity and astonishment, we started to lose faith in our own epistemic, creative, and moral sovereignty. And we became addictively enslaved to the words of experts and their seductively deceptive artifice of formulating neatly enclosed, hierarchically ordered, and commodified theories of what is true, what is beautiful, what is normal, and what is good, none in our own image and interests, but instead in the image and interests of domination. For most of our ancestors, the process of getting stuck began only in the last few thousand years as it gradually transmogrified into waves of conquest and colonialism that have now infected every corner of our world like a virus, slowly but inexorably strangling its host, both colonizer and colonized. Domination and ruination is not the only way, it's not the way it has always been, the way it is, and the way it always will be. If this were so, we would have vanished from the face of the earth long, long ago. Power is not over there or elsewhere. It is right here in us and in the rhizomatic life-giving networks that we establish and nurture among us. But systems of domination only acquire their false power to the extent that we refuse to acknowledge, claim, and exercise the real sovereign powers that, up until quite recently, were enjoyed by all of our ancestors.
Linguists and other scientists in the Western tradition have played a key role in bringing about the apocalyptic state of affairs. By positioning ourselves and allowing ourselves to be positioned as experts on language, we as linguists have wittingly and or unwittingly usurped and enclosed the epistemic sovereignty to determine what is linguistically real, true, normal, and good, which was enjoyed by all of our ancestors as part of our commons for all but the last few thousand years of the 300,000-year longue durée of human history. While we trivialize and dismiss the work of those linguists who actually let the living language speak to them, we glorify the work of so-called serious theorists whose ultimate goal is to enclose real language by forcing it into a preconceived theoretical framework designed to predict and control it, thereby reducing it to a supposed realer universal system that exists somewhere in an idealized Platonic world beyond the reach of all but us, the initiates with higher degrees in linguistics.
In the process, we extinguish humanity's powers over the awesome materiality of language, allowing that awesome materiality to be used against us instead in the interest of domination. Among the regions where it is least possible to pretend under the colonial gaze that there are unitary languages, cultures, and identities are those places which have emerged for one reason or another as salient examples of the intense contact among genetic, linguistic, cultural, ethnic, and epistemic repertoires that the study of ancient DNA has revealed to have been the rule rather than the exception for humanity virtually everywhere and always. One such region is the southern coast of Kenya along the vibrant waterborne corridor of exchange that we have come to know as the Indian Ocean. Because contact and exchange have been so intense here, the results have been even more difficult and resistant than usual for us to enclose and domesticate in our theoretical straitjackets and neat categories.
Our intellectual encounters with people from the coast of Kenya before we arrived there began with discussions about Udu, which might be roughly defined as humanity in Swahili. Udu refers, at least in part, to what makes us sovereign beings, that is, a deep acknowledgement of the fact that real power lies within ourselves, as well as in our relationship with others, an understanding that resonates with the Glasson's reconceptualization of Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the rhizome to account for the mangrove-like multiplex configurations of linguistic, cultural, and identificational repertoires in the Caribbean. In Diani to the south of Mombasa and Bamburi to the north, as well as in the other areas along the Kenyan coast, most impacted by the tourism industry, the life-giving landscape has been substantially ruined by the destruction of the mangroves and the erection of walls surrounding individual plots of land to exclude access to them.
This physical violence and commodification inflicted on the coastline is strikingly similar to the discursive violence and commodification that Western science has inflicted on notions of language, culture, and identity, removing them from their rhizomatic and life-giving matrix of entanglements in order to isolate instances of a singular artificially reified monolithic language, a singular artificially reified monolithic culture, and a singular artificially reified monolithic identity. As if we were alchemists, we as linguists inflict further violence on language, draining it of its living, life-seeking, and life-giving powers by analytically breaking it down into its essences or neatly defined categories, binary features, etc. We also use our completely disembodied linguistic theories to engineer a purportedly universal economy of artificial units and processes that are supposed to represent what language really is in the abstract, Platonic realm of mathematical and formal logic manifested as the sufficiently constrained syntactic tree models of universal grammar, optimality tables purposefully constructed according to explicitly violent principles such as constrained hierarchies and domination, etc.
On the coast of Kenya, our colleague Angelica Mietzner approached Johnson Wansia, a graphic artist from a bit further inland, and asked him to depict in the form of a painting what he understood to be the meaning of udumu, which in Swahili dictionaries appears to be the word that might best correspond to longue durée.
What Mwanzia decided to paint was a montage of many of the most important life-giving things that, paraphrasing his own words, are already here when we are born and are still here when we die. At the center of the painting, the viewer's eye is immediately drawn to a woman carrying a child on her back. Mwanzia also painted a range of rhizomatically interconnected images depicting a number of activities related to the commons and the knowledges and practices that enable us to deal creatively and resourcefully with contingency and to hospitably share and cooperate in the face of contingency. These knowledges and practices, including language, which are prototypically associated with and learned from our relationships with our mothers, grandmothers, and other female relations, have become just as important as our physical bodies in making us who we are. Thus, Uru and Udumu can also be seen as the body of knowledges and practices, including the linguistic knowledges and practices, which are linked to our physically and socially embodied subsistence that have always and will always make it possible for us, not only to survive, but dealing with contingency, but to thrive. But because these practices are based on sharing and service, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by capitalism and other systems of accumulation and plunder. Because they are based on openness, inclusivity, and networking, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by racism and other forms of chauvinism and ethnocentrism. Because they are taught to us by our mothers and other female relatives, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by sexism and other forms of patriarchy. Because they are based on custodianship of our natural commons, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by ecocidal notions of development and other forms of anthropocentrism.
Even though it is these physically and socially embodied life ways that make it possible for all of us to do what is most important and fulfilling in life, we normally do not acknowledge or valorize them. For example, the labor that most women do to keep all of us healthy and happy is rarely even seen as labor at all, and definitely not compensated as such. And what does this have to do with linguistics? Everything. According to the hierarchical monocausal family tree model, which is predominates in historical linguistics, the language of the conquered woman in Roman Empire, for example, have been erased, ignored, and trivialized in relation to the Latin spoken by the conquering soldiers. According to Chomsky's theory of poverty of stimulus, which predominates in language acquisition studies, the year that mothers and other female relatives spend in teaching us language has been erased, ignored, and trivialized in relation to the working of a hierarchical and monolithic universal grammar in the child's brain.
Because conceptualizations of longue durée have typically replicated linear and evolutionary notions of time, which are exclusively focused on the very brief and recent period in human history that has unfolded since we have gotten stuck in the trap of systems of domination. And because these conceptualizations have effectively erased, ignored, and trivialized Utu, Udumu, and the other knowledges and practices that have made any form of longue durée possible for our species in the first place. We have often found it necessary in our work to replace the notion of longue durée with much richer, thicker, and more satisfying of notion of durée profonde or deep durée. Durée profonde in the 1001 things that all of us everywhere do every day to embrace contingency, survive and thrive, despite the odds stacked against us by death-seeking systems of domination and colonization that are ruining our lives.
Durée profonde, like dark matter and dark energy, constitutes the matrix in which we seek, find, and create life, wherever we are, be it in an indigenous community which still lives in the abundance of subsistence, be it in communities such as Kinango, where climate change-induced drought has brought people to the brink of starvation, be it in communities such as Tiwi, where the enclosure and invasion of traditional land by corporate and private interests linked to a ruinous tourism industry has made subsistence farming virtually impossible, be it in the marketplaces of Mombasa, where female control over food and distribution ensure that all of the townspeople have something to eat, be it in the industrial neighborhoods of Nairobi, where people struggle but manage to get by, to somehow make it to the next day. Once we begin to become conscious of the deep, rich, thick, life-giving, and life-seeking matrix of Durée profonde by beginning to undo its erasure and invisibilization, not only can we begin the process of imagining a decolonial linguistics, but we can also begin remembering and reclaiming the sovereignties enjoyed by all of our ancestors over the longue durée of human existence on the earth. Jure Profonde is still very much alive and has permitted us to find life in the midst of death-seeking systems of domination and colonization. This means that we do not have to start from zero. We have a strong foundation in our day-to-day practice as human beings and as linguists, upon which we can build to make the world a better place to live, as well as to bring linguistics back to earth and re-embody the study of language in its material and social contexts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you to my co-presenters, to our co-presenters for excellent performances, excellent presentations. Now we'll open it up for questions. After the questions, we'll take a 5-minute break. But in any case, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Any questions, comments?
Question. Is the word you are using, is it Ubuntu?
Utu. And
Utu, is it similar to Ubuntu?
Yes. Okay. So Ubuntu, yes, it is. But Ubuntu may have some other type of understandings associated with it, but they're very much alike. Yes. So Utu, for in the conversations that we've had from people from the East, is tied with the idea of humanity, what makes human beings human, and it's and in that conceptualization of humanity, there are many of those contradictions and false oppositions that upon which patriarchy, ethnocentrism, plunder, capitalism, and anthropocentrism, ecocide based are actually dissolve. So it's not an understanding of humanity that, for example, in terms of anthropocentrism, it's not an understanding of humanity that separates human beings from the rest of the world, but actually is an inclusive understanding that human beings are part of the rest of the world as a living as a living thing, as a living as a symphony of living entities. And not just entities, but energies and waves. So even the understanding of humanity as particulate beings or as individual entities is questioned, because you have this wave-like rhizomatic aspect to it as well.
Yeah. This is a digressive question.
It's okay.
The presenters all talked about control and the desire to control language and to basically dehumanize it and send it somewhere only a select initiates can participate in. Don't you think without control there will be no resistance, and without resistance there's no creativity?
Well, you know, actually within systems of domination, a lot of times creativity is restricted to resistance, but actually, again, if I would go back to this idea of durée profonde. There's incredible creativity that's not done in the paradigm of resistance. It makes it look like it's resistance because it's creating life within a system of death. So it looks like resistance, but actually it harkens us back, I would argue, to a time when, a time before domination, before patriarchy, before ethnocentrism, before plunder, before anthropocentrism, where it wasn't framed that way, but people were still incredibly creative. So this is another thing that is being shown more and more as ancient DNA and anthropology, archaeology are progressing at a rapid pace right now. So the findings are just getting more and more and more exciting. So the depth of time, for example, for watercraft. So watercraft goes back not just from before Homo sapiens, people were traveling over water by boats and other kinds of watercraft for the last 900,000 years. That's Homo erectus. That's like before there were even Homo sapiens. So in other words, our ancestors are incredibly clever, incredibly creative, and just look at language, how creative that is, and what an investment in creativity that is. Clothing, going back not just thousands of years, and but actually stitching and this type of stuff. Speaking of stitching, going back to our first presentation, going back at least 190,000 years. In other words, this human creativity was always there, and actually we have this. We're taught this myth that humans become incredibly creative only within the constraints of systems of domination, where it's expressed as some kind of resistance. But actually, I think that probably creativity is the norm rather than the exception when it comes to our existence on the earth. You have to be incredibly creative to survive and thrive in any kind of ecosystem. And probably the thing that's guaranteed our survival for this long has been our ability to be co-creative. So it's not about survival of the fittest. All those Darwinian ideas are incredibly simplistic and incredibly limiting. But actually, rather than the survival of the fittest being the thing that's permitted us to survive and thrive, it's our ability to reach out to others and not compete with them, but to cooperate with them that has actually been the key to our success. And but of course, again, sometimes we have reached out to each other, not in the name of creating life, but also in the name of seeking death. And there is where, and that's where we got stuck. And in the what anthropologists are talking about now is getting stuck, where we get stuck in systems of domination and violence and ethnocentrism, racism, plunder, capitalism, anthropocentrism, and patriarchy. More questions, comments? Questions, comments? Okay, it's time for a well-deserved break. Let's break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and have our next presentation. We have 2 more presentations to go, so we may go over time. I hope that's okay. Is that okay, Deli, or do you want to go first? Deli, are you there? Deli? Okay, she must have stepped away for a minute. So anyway, we'll come back in 10 minutes. That'll be at something like 3:50 Puerto Rico time. Daly, are you there? Daly? Daly?
Yes, hello. I'm willing to go next if that's okay.
Would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Professor,
Yes?
I actually have to step away because I have to go get, I sent you a message, so.
It's okay.
If the other person goes first, then somebody would have to read my work, my
Okay.
slide.
No problem.
Okay.
No problem. We can do that. Okay. So Delhi, let's get your slides up here while we're waiting. Here we go.
Permiso para clase.
Yes.
Hi. It's about 3 a.m. here.
Yeah.
Is it possible for me to kind of step out and
Yeah,
go to
it's
bed?
okay. It's okay. It's okay. We can. That's not a problem. What I'm going to do is, when your slides come up, we'll have somebody. Or I'll just read them. So it's not a problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I guess it's time to come back from our break now. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, we have two more presentations. Our next presentation is titled Healing Through Music, Xylophone Dirge Among the Dagaba, and it's presented by Delimini Kouabon. So I'll give the floor over to Deli.
Thank you. So this presentation is part of my master's research on funeral dirge performance amongst the Dagaba of West Africa. One of the most important elements of Dagaba culture is an instrument, the xylophone or the jili. The jili is a pentatonic scale instrument constructed on a wooden frame, and it uses gourds with holes drilled in them and covered with membranes of spider webs as resonators to amplify the instrument's sound. Mallets are then used to strike the keys. This instrument is found in most Mande and voltaic groups. There are two types, the Daga jili with 18 keys that is used for funeral and major recreational performances, and the low jili with 14 keys, which is used in religious ceremonies and to make announcements. And the one that's pictured is the low jili. The funeral dirge performance is the main event of a Dagaba funeral. The dirge is designed to help the bereaved navigate the permanent physical separation from a loved one and to adjust to their new life situation. The jili is an inherently spiritual instrument. Praise of the deceased in the dirges magnifies the loss in the bereaved, increasing the intensity of mourning. Praise of the extended family and the deceased ancestors acts as a commendation for the deceased to be allowed to enter Dapare, which is the ancestral realm, and to become an ancestor. Dirges can also critique wrongdoings in the family and act as public encouragement to change their behaviors. They're also a means of public discourse in a way of sharing oral history and communicating traditional beliefs between participants and the community. All of this helps in creating the atmosphere of mourning. When it is played, the jili is described as weeping or crying. The xylophone itself is lamenting. Next is a clip of audio of a vocal instrumental tuning at the start of a funeral dirge performance by Bernard Woma. In this, you can hear all the elements of the Dagaba funeral dirge, which includes the xylophones, the gourd drum, the dirge chanters, and the male chorus.
Deli, do you have a clip of that you want to present? I can allow you to share it.
Oh, this other one.
Okay. Anyway,
yeah.
Go ahead then with your presentation.
Okay,
Sorry.
if you could go to the next slide and then. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if it'll.
So why exactly does the Dagaba dirge lead to healing? It's a rather complicated set of psychosocial and spiritual connections that are entangled together. As music can, the dirge performance can move people deeply, causing them to grieve quite vigorously. And part of this grieving is through dance, as a way for people to express their grief. And it's known that physical movement helps to change the makeup of the brain. There are also spiritual elements to the jili, which alone may make hearing it lead to healing. Dirge performance also allows participants to mourn as often as they feel the need to for their lost loved one. Periodic catharsis can help in preventing the development of pathological grief. Dirge performance brings the community together as well. By gathering and supporting the bereaved, they strengthen community bonds and create a base of stability that is available whenever someone is mourning. If you pay close attention to the higher notes of the jili, those constitute the melody that is the text. In other words, that is what the jili is speaking or singing. In the next example, the goba is both chanting and playing the same dirge. So that dirge is a lament for orphans or for the death of a parent, and it emphasizes the circle of life where everyone becomes an orphan at some point. In conclusion, the Jili dirge is of vital importance amongst the Dagaba. The cry of the Jili draws the community together in solidarity with the bereaved. The dirge performance allows space for participants to openly grieve, and without this performance, the deceased cannot enter into the spirit world and will be stuck in limbo between the physical and spirit world. Whether living in another part of Ghana or even overseas, the traditional funeral must be performed. Although the deceased may be buried wherever they passed, the funeral is always sent home for them to be properly mourned, and that mourning occurs during the dirge performance. Even without understanding the language of the Jili, it is not, as not every Dagao does. Cultural memory allows one to experience the cathartic effects of its performance. Belief in the spiritual aspects of Jili sound also contribute to its healing abilities. Without the Jili, the cultural structure of mourning would be disrupted, leading to a variety of psychological and sociological issues in individuals and the community. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. And it ties in so much with what we've been talking about before. In some ways, we've been talking about transitions. We've been talking about transitions between worlds. We've been talking about also weaving together of texts and musics and spider webs. That was fascinating that spider webs are used for these resonances, because in fact, if you look at the what physicists are talking about now, they finally admitted that Western physics has finally admitted that it can't see 95% of what's out there in the world. It calls it dark matter and dark energy. And now they're saying that actually our cosmos is made up of 95% dark matter and dark energy, which they have no way of seeing. I would argue that it's Western science that has made us blind, that actually these things are seeable. It's just that we don't give ourselves permission to see these things because of the ways that we've been programmed to see. But in any case, music is one of the ways that we can see beyond that 5%. And so again, it's that, and so that other 95%, when they begin to picture it, looks like a spider web. It looks like a matrix of threads, and that goes back to this understanding of fabric and text that we talked about after the first presentation, and how the music, the singing, the dancing, and the resonances created through those spider webs, in fact, provide healing, because what gives us life, we argued in the last presentation, is that 95% of the stuff we can't see. A death-seeking science can only see the part of reality that seeks death, which is just a small part, that 5%. But the life-seeking part of reality, it can't see. And that's the matrix which gives us life and allows us to subsist and to thrive. And I think that resonates all the way through this excellent presentation. More comments and questions?
Comment?
Yes.
Those of you interested in the Summer's philosophies, the husband, that's Sobonfu's husband, Patrice Malidama Summers' funeral was performed sometime in January 2022, which you can find on YouTube. So if you go and you type in YouTube, and you can see how Sobonfu, who died much earlier in 2017, and then the husband, Patrice, who died in 2021. And then his funeral, his body was taken back from the United States, or is it Geneva, to Burkina Faso, to his village, and the funeral was held there so that he could join his ancestors. But Dali, the question is, you talked about cultural memory. How can you, in what way do you think the funeral performance kind of resurrects cultural memory?
I guess like through, I don't know, maybe it's something innate in the fact that, like, say for me, because like my parents experience this cultural phenomenon, it might also carry over into the next generation. So where when I hear it, even though I haven't experienced it as often or been immersed in the culture, it still has a profound effect.
Actually, I think you're completely right, Deli. But I think that also, if we're talking about that 95% again, and the fact that physicists are telling us that information is never destroyed. So, in fact, it's still living out there, and maybe we've been taught not to connect with it or to acknowledge it, but it's there. And so maybe that's another element of this, is that because of the fact that you grew up in a family with this tradition, that you give yourself permission to access that, whereas other people don't. So there are all kinds of ways we can talk about cultural memory now that we couldn't talk about it, that we couldn't use to talk about it before, because Western science wouldn't allow us to. But actually now we can start to explore these other things that many other sciences, maybe the other 6,000 sciences that are out there, that each indigenous particular population or each ethnic configuration has, often talk about the fact that we can access these things without maybe having experienced them directly. So there are all kinds of ways that biologists are telling us as well that things get imprinted on DNA, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all kinds of ways that we can talk about these things as well. But I think that that what you mentioned, getting in contact with these things through the rhizomatic networks that we have, like our families, et cetera, are also incredibly powerful ways to get in touch with cultural memory. More questions, comments?
I would like to add that I think it was just last night that I went to bed reading some philosophy themes from Nietzsche. And I think he's the one that mentioned that if there is an actual real universal language, it's music. So right there, I really thank Deli for sharing this with us, because I'm in a total different mood right now after I heard that music. So right there, we can have this stressful day, and the power of music it's without words. I'm really relaxed right now. So thank you, Deli, for sharing with us.
Thank you.
So you've performed a healing, Deli.
Yes, she did indeed.
Yes, but no, when linguists talk about universal grammar, they completely miss the point, because actually when we're talking about the function of language, getting people to resonate with each other, there's no more effective way than music. And it's done in so many diverse ways, because there are so many musics out there, but they all can have this aspect of healing as well. So yeah, and again, this connects with the healing energies of people who are positioned as two-spirited or as gatekeepers or trans people. Again, it works that way too, and it's very life-seeking. So yeah.
And the Dagaba funeral in Burkina Faso is called, they are the same people called Dagara, Dagaba, Dagate, Wala. The funeral is one of the most central cultural. In fact, the Dagaba life revolves around life and the world beyond. That is the physical life that we see. So at the funeral ground, it is said, it is not just humans. all the ancestors who have gone beyond, but who are still around spiritually, are there at the funeral ground to welcome the new spirit. Then the living are there mourning, not mourning for that particular period, but mourning the cultural memory of mourning and healing, etc., etc. So at the funeral ground is considered a very ritual, spiritual ground. It's not just a dead body and people drinking rum or having fun. Nothing evil is supposed to happen at the funeral grounds. And the xylophones being spiritual instruments, as the presenter mentioned, the drum being a spiritual instrument, the chanting, the wailing, everything is happening, plus laughter also, of course. There's abuse poetry going on. There are responses going on. There's call and response. Everything is happening at once. So if we are talking about transgressive interrelationships, this is where we can find some of those aspects. It's like a carnival situation, a carnival of tears, but also a carnival of life, promoting life over death. So thanks for the presentation.
It's like the ultimate trans performance. In other words, even in a moment that is defined by death, you're doing these incredibly life-seeking things and showing death that I don't know. What does your name mean, Danabang? I'm sorry, Kuabong. What does Kuabong mean?
It means, what is death? Or as muerte.
Yeah. What is death? Because life, because it's all about life. It's all about life. So you can even create and celebrate life in the face of the death of somebody who you love very dearly. So again, in a way, it's a very, very transperformative thing as well.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions or comments?
Oh, there are stories of the dead, the corpse rising at midnight, participate in the dancing. They can't help it.
Can't help it.
They are their own funeral, and then during the performance of the funeral, they just can't help it. They rise up. Only those gifted with the ability to see them.
Okay, so I was mistaken. This was not the ultimate transperformance. The ultimate transperformance is when the dead arises at 12 o'clock and starts dancing because they can't help it. Yes.
They can't help it.
That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it looks like it's time to go to our last presentation then. But once again, congratulations on an excellent presentation and one that was both moving and healing and intellectually fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can get the next one up here. And this will be our last one. This is it, I think. Now, there may be some pauses in this presentation because a couple of the people that were supposed to present had to leave because we've gone over time. But if you hear a pause, that means that one of us will pick it up and actually say the slide for the person who was supposed to say it. But unfortunately, bear with us while we do that. Let's see, here we go. Okay, this presentation is titled Intersectionality and Racist Ethnocentric Discourse in the Afro-Atlantic. I was put together by a team from the Universidad de Puerto Rico.
Across the Afro-Atlantic, novel understandings of hybridity and rhizomatic connection are helping us to acknowledge the multiplex dimensions of intersectionality. As a result, the plurigenetic and multidirectional trajectories of ethnocentrism/racism and other systems of discursive and coercive domination are becoming better understood. This has allowed us to abandon the futile quest to determine a singular fundamental unifying dynamic to which can be traced all of the different systems of domination that are ruining our lives, in favor of a more intersectional recognition that ethnocentrism/racism, patriarchy/cis-heterosexism, economic plunder/capitalism, and anthropocentrism/ecocide are inextricably and irretrievably intertwined and mutually conditioned and codependent.
So here you can see all of these different systems of domination as different heads that belong to the same body, which means that we can't just, if you want to challenge one head, okay, you have to challenge all of them at the same time. Otherwise, you may cut off one head, but the others will still be there. And the one head that you cut off will eventually regrow. In this presentation, we provide examples from both the colonial past and the neo-colonial present in the Afro-Atlantic, which demonstrate that any one of these systems could not exist without all of the others, and the intensification of any one of them involves a concomitant intensification of all of the others. While such an approach questions and complicates traditional Western anti-racist, feminist, Marxist, and ecologist discourses, it's already proving its merit in achieving a more nuanced grasp of how profoundly manipulative hegemonies have operated how profoundly manipulative hegemonies have operated in real lives, and how such hegemonies have been unsettled and subverted in countless ways by real people in the Afro-Atlantic. Because these subversive acts are situated within rhizomatic networks, where a multitude of dynamics of identification, counter-identification, and disidentification are constantly reconfiguring themselves, it is becoming increasingly clear that some of the most promising frameworks are those that allow for messy and simultaneously trans-raced, transgendered, transclassed, and transspeciated performances. The theories and theorists of Western physical and social scientists, including ethnography, history, linguistics, and anthropology, consistently erase everything that does not conform to their colonial view of the world. There are many who do good and useful science, but they do it in spite of theory, not because of it. The Caribbean and the coasts of West and Central Africa were the testing ground for the successive waves of colonization and globalization represented by the European invasion of the rest of the world that began in the 1400s. The birth of capitalism as a world system of unprecedented plunder took place in the Afro-Atlantic. But this would have been impossible without an unprecedented intensification of ethnocentrism in the form of the racialization of entire societies, an unprecedented intensification of patriarchy through the burning of millions of women and LGBTQ+ people as demons and witches, and an unprecedented intensification of anthropocentrism and ecocide.
The first successful subversion of a tidy colonial paradigm was made possible by powerful, wild, and messy intersectional trans performances by people raised as minus white, gendered as minus male, and classed as minus propertied. From 1500 to 1700, the Iberian pre-racialized, pre-capitalist paradigm of colonization was subverted by Afro-Indigenous enslaved women who played a leading role in the successful Afro-indigenization of colonial politics, economy, culture, and bloodlines. The second successful subversion of a tidy colonial paradigm was also made possible by powerful, wild, and messy intersectional trans performances by people raised as minus white, gendered as minus male, and classed as minus propertied.
From 1700 to 1900, the Anglo-Dutch racialized capitalist paradigm of colonization was subverted by Afro-Indigenous enslaved women, who played a leading role in the establishment of Afro-Indigenous gardens and markets, which played a key role in the abolition of chattel enslavement. During the first paradigm of colonization from 1500 to 1700, 70% of the land mass of the Americas remained under indigenous control. 80% of all the arrivals to the Americas were from Africa, not Europe. The few arrivals from Europe to the Americas were mainly males from the most marginalized and criminalized classes. And the main thing that stood between death and European males in the Afro-Atlantic were their non-European sexual partners. These women took advantage of their powerful position as environmental and cultural mediators to go on the offensive and become agents in the successful subversion, feminization, and Afro-indigenization of Iberian colonial bloodlines, lifeways, languages, and societies.
The complete racialization of colonial societies that marks the transition from the first to the second paradigm of colonialism in the 17th century, Afro-Atlantic was a reaction to pluriethnic resistance on the part of the non-propertied working classes. Spears notes that in the US, Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 is often considered a landmark in the rise of racism as an institution. In it, Blacks, Native Americans, and the majority of whites who were poor joined forces to attack the landed elite's oppressive rule. The rebellion was suppressed, but it instigated a flurry of state and other actions to divide the constituent groups who forged the rebellion. Thus, the major impetus emerged to distinguish a white identity with more privilege. During the second paradigm of colonization, at least two sources can be acknowledged for enslaved women's subsistence gardening and marketing networks in the Afro-Atlantic. Traditionally, female-controlled subsistence gardening and marketing in both West Africa and the indigenous Americas. The struggles of enslaved women of African descent for subsistence gardens and markets on the proto-capitalist plantations of 16th century Annobam and Sao Tome off the coast of Central Africa, which led to the first permanent overthrow of colonial plantation societies in the Afro-Atlantic.
Often drawing crowds of thousands of people, female-controlled markets expanded in function from venues for autonomous economic activity where they sold the produce of their subsistence gardens to become hubs for autonomous cultural and political activity as well, especially for planning and coordinating resistance to enslavement and for sharing news about uprisings in other colonies. Through their weekly markets, the enslaved could maintain social networks that extended far beyond the borders of the particular plantations to which they were legally bound. Even Maroons came to these markets. Moving from social networks in the colonial past to social networks in the neo-colonial present, content on TikTok's For You page, such as the video skits presented on the following slides, convert the platform into a wild and messy space.
In this space, questioning, upending, and contesting artificial reified binaries such as white versus black, male versus female, and rich versus poor takes place through subversive acts of trans performance, which often have an intersectional counter-hegemonic value that is more than the sum of their parts. This skit involves two co-workers. Hey there, Jasmine?
Yes, come in.
Okay, awesome. Your last name, I'm sorry, I couldn't pronounce it. Where's it from?
Oh yeah, it's Nigerian, yeah.
So beautiful, oh my God. Maybe I'll just call you by a shorter name.
Huh?
Do you have a nickname maybe I can call you?
No, people usually just pronounce it, huh?
Are you kidding? I could never pronounce it, never. I could never, huh?
Right, let me finish this email. You sit down, keep practicing.
Ida, get what?
Spell it out.
I tried, I promise.
I have faith in you. I think you can do it. You can do it, yeah. If you can pronounce all those beers, you can pronounce that. Okay.
Well, that's not really the same. Ida, just let me call you J.I. This is J.I.
No, keep going though, keep trying. I have faith.
Are you seriously gonna make this a big deal? Like I can't just call you J.I.?
No.
Are you kidding me? This video illustrates how A's failure to seriously attempt to pronounce B's name is not merely an everyday occurrence, but also a racially charged microaggression whereby B finds herself obliged to establish a boundary while still projecting calmness and avoiding the angry Black woman trope. This is what Morgan refers to as coolness, a transperformative signifier which, along with the positive social face, makes the person appear inscrutable and in complete control of her emotions and body. Because her stance and social face are unreadable, she appears immune to racist and sexist taunts and threats and verbal insults.
Here's an example of a video that involves a supervisor and an employee. Margin, it's been so long since you've come scuttling into my office. That hair, goodness, it's just so distracting. Have you ever considered perming your hair? Yeah, just, I wonder what it would be like, you know, if it was different. So what's the problem? We don't have any days off for Christmas? Does anyone in the office celebrate Christmas? Oh, you do? Adorable. We have half days for all of Hanukkah, and then this year we were able to provide all of Kwanzaa off, so I would celebrate Christmas then. We can't accommodate any additional time off. Here's another video that involves a real estate agent and someone who wants to sell their house. This is your house? All right, yeah. This is fine. It's outside the city, but it's not the outer city. Let's go inside. Is this your family? Cute. Listen, if you want to sell this house, you need to remove all these photos and replace them with an all-American family, okay? Points to a live, laugh, love sign. This will need to come down. Everything gang-related needs to come down. In these satirical videos, we find dominant discursive intersectionalities between racing and gendering cleverly flipped and upended in reference to what Margin is asked to do with her stereotypically plus white straight hair by her trans performative minus white supervisor. We also find dominant discursive intersectionalities between racing and socioeconomic classing flipped and upended in relation to what the trans performative minus white excuse me, real estate broker tells the plus white seller they need to do in order to make their house less associated with stereotypically plus white images. The real estate agent skit is also a flipped example of race metonymies, whereby people and features raised as plus white can serve as metonyms for American, while people and features raised as minus white cannot serve as metonyms for American.
Many of the videos by at Clarabelle CWB illustrate the point made by Morgan that, quote, we must recognize that there may be embedded harmful meaning regarding race, gender, and sexuality during what is thought to be general American communication, end quote. Because TikTok has been a space for community seeking and creation, finding common ground on social justice issues and organization, protest or movement, the app is facing potential ban in US.
To these ends, the Data Act and the Restrict Act were proposed by a bipartisan group of US senators under the guise of online protection of privacy and of children. While deflecting by framing this as a privacy and child protection issue, what they really want to avoid is intersectional community building on TikTok. Thank you.
To thank our co-presenters for a great performance. Unfortunately, some people were not there that should have been part of the team, but they had to leave because we went over time. So questions or comments?
Well, great presentation to round this symposium off, because it touches on the first presentation, second presentation, third presentation, all the presentations. So from slavery days to contemporary, TikTok, etc., etc. And for me, it's almost every day, not every day, that's exaggerated. Almost every now and then, I am confronted with the same kind of issues that this presentation. I meet people and they say, oh, so what's your name? I said, why do you want to know my name? What is yours? You introduce yourself first. Also, what are you doing in Puerto Rico? Are you a student or are you a visitor, etc., etc.? And I have time. I become cool. I really become cruel in my process of getting the people to begin to question why they're asking me those questions. And I said, have you gone to the US before? When you pronounce your name and your accent, do you face the same questions? How is your response? And then they suddenly understand. So it's I'm talking about a global situation. It's not just limited to the US, in which we want to control another person's name. We want to control their being completely, without while refusing to allow ourselves to be educated. The first TikTok, the girl is just refusing. It's not that she's not able. She's just refusing. I am in control here, and I refuse to pronounce a name that is not European. Period. So for me, it's this a great presentation that we all face these things occasionally. Okay, so it's I don't want us to go away thinking that it's just peculiar to race or gender or geographical origins, etc., etc. But it depends on where we find ourselves, where we are. And perhaps the cool characters in these videos are telling us individuals how to behave when we are confronted with this kind of other and refusal to see us as a person and so on. So thank you so much for speaking out. So it's not a question, it's a commendation.
Yes, yes, and this is so, you know, when people talk about US society and Western societies as being so open and so melting pots, all of these ideas, actually, it's true that people come to these places from many parts of the world, but when people arrive, they're expected to actually speak, act, identify, strive for the same norms. And so that's again part of that myth. And these norms are so restrictive and so homogenizing, and though they're also unattainable. So this is another thing that is important to understand. They're not just unattainable by the people who are othered by them. They're also unattainable by the people who are supposedly included in them. So no man will ever be the ideal male. No person who's raised as white will ever be really the ideal white person. No person who's ever rich will be the ideal rich person. Just look at all the rich people. What is their 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365-day job? Finding more money. So in other words, they'll never attain, these are unattainable norms that keep us all like hamsters on the wheel, trying to attain something that we'll never attain, which means we spend our whole lives doing what they want us to do instead of doing things in our own image and interests. Questions, comments?
I mean, who has watched the movie Steve Biko?
Yes.
And the court scene, the judge, who is Anglo South African, is asking Steve Biko, why do you people refer to yourselves as black? That he looks at Steve Biko and he says he's more brown than black. And Biko in response says, why do you call yourselves white? You are more pink than white. And the judge is quiet and says, you are right. You are right. So these dichotomies of black and white, this and that, these are, or even Creole or this, I'm beginning to suspect they are new systems of controlling how we think.
Absolutely.
Even when we say use the word trans, we are transcend. It's another controlling language that unless you buy into that kind of lengua, or let's say tongua, okay, you are out there, or you are in there. So that is I'm saying that because the word messy that is used in the presentation, the word wild, it has all these connotations. And I was going to ask why do we say messy and wild when we are describing these other contestations?
Yes. Okay. So basically, the names messy and wild go back to the point you were making about colonized minds and the way that our minds have been colonized to permit us to colonize ourselves. Rather than have somebody with a whip colonizing us all the time, we can actually do it to ourselves and to everybody else around us, is by reducing something that's living and entangled and messy and wild into something that's domesticated and tidy in its nice little neat conceptual box. And so that formation of these conceptual boxes and neat oppositions, black and white and rich and poor and male and female, etc., is part of the colonization process. And so messy is something that you never hear about striving for messiness or striving for wildness in academic presentations, because academics are all about creating those boxes, those neat boxes. So what we are doing here is being a little naughty. And we're saying, as academics, why not seek out some messiness and some wildness and actually celebrate it? In other words, think about science, okay? All of our theorists are trying to reduce living reality into dead boxes or dead material that can be put into a box. Of course, the ultimate box is the coffin that your body goes into when it ceases to be part of this particular realm. But as we know, that even out of that box, you can be tempted to dance at midnight if the right music is being played. In any case, no, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people who do good science in Western science. But I would argue that the good science that's being done in Western science is in spite of all those theories.
Yes.
So good linguists do good language work if they ignore Chomsky completely, and they actually let the language, the fascinating, messy, wild stuff that's going on between people when they're speaking, let that speak to them as linguists, listen to it, take it, acknowledge it, and then actually try to come to terms with that messiness, come to terms with that wildness that doesn't domesticate it, but actually celebrates it. And I think that that's a new kind of linguistics we can be doing. So I think that and that's the new kind of science that we can be doing, because a lot of people who do good Western science are always looking over their shoulder at theory and saying, well, this doesn't really fit the theory, but I'm still going to say it, okay? Whereas the theorist will just say it doesn't exist. What you're talking about doesn't exist. I have a way to explain it away and put it into another neat box. But actually, anything that's living is by its very definition wild, unpredictable, uncontrollable, undomesticatable, and messy. Okay, and the only time when you achieve an absence of messiness and wildness, and when you're completely domesticated, when you're completely under control, is when you die. But even then, sometimes the music can make you dance even out of your coffin at midnight, if it's the right music.
Because even when you die, as my father used to say, when I'm dead, if they refuse to mourn me, I don't care. I'm also dead. If they refuse to bury me, it's their problem, because I will stink up their nostrils. So even when you are dead, you can be messy. You can continue to be messy. You can mess up people's emotions. And you can mess up their minds.
Yes.
Your spirit will continue to live on. Your flesh becomes manure and continues to. The best manure is the messy manure.
Yes.
So I like the word messiness and wildness that is uncontrollable. So yeah.
And really, when we say control, we should always say it with the understanding that this is just an illusion of control. It's not real.
Yes.
In other words, when the systems of domination seek control, but it's an illusion. So in other words, if it's alive, it can never be controlled. The only way for these systems of domination to achieve control, total control, is to kill everything that's alive. And that's why we talk of them as death-seeking systems.
Yeah.
And if you look at life and like raising a child, if you could try to control that child completely, you'll kill your child. But then if you start to think of control in another way, messy, wild way, in other words, if you start to let the child that you're raising speak to you and change you and create growth within you, then there's another kind of control that's more about sovereignty. It's not about trying to box something in, but actually working with something to create more life and to celebrate life and I think that if we take that approach to science and linguistics, then we'll be doing the kind of science and linguistics that'll connect with people, so that the next time there's a pandemic, people will trust us as scientists and take our vaccines instead of denying us, because we have always positioned ourselves as these experts who know everything. And so when we try to connect, if we can do the kind of linguistics and science that connect with people, our science and our linguistics will be much better received than they are now. Most people, when they see the way we do linguistics, cannot relate to it. And most people, when they think of scientists, they think of something that they can't relate to and something they can't understand. And now they're even thinking of Western science as something that they want to distance themselves from as much as possible. So in order to reconnect with the people that we're supposedly trying to serve with our sciences and our linguistics, we have to turn our science and our linguistics into something that's life-seeking instead of something that's death-seeking, and something that's not afraid to come to terms with the wildness and messiness of the phenomena that we're supposedly trying to account for. And this gets back to Swan's point about the fact that transness is about that kind of messiness and constant change and constant. So it's really wonderful when Swan talks about Groupie D, that she says that Groupie D is planning on changing their name many, many times during their life, because that means that we have to keep reinventing and recreating ourselves as long as we're living. That's what we're doing. Okay, any more questions or comments about that presentation? ¿Más preguntas, más comentarios? Swan?
We can't hear you.
Está entrecortado. La voz entrecortada ahora. No sé. Bueno, yo voy a apagar mi correo electrónico. I'm going to turn off my email. Maybe it'll do better. ¿Puedes entrar una vez más?
Sí, yo creo que ahora sí me escuchan, ¿verdad?
Ahora sí.
Es que estoy en el trabajo. Mira, what's the name of the movie? Frances y Suárez tienen la misma pregunta. The name of the movie. ¿Alguien ayúdeme?
Cry freedom, cry freedom, cry freedom.
Cry freedom, yes.
Yes, cry freedom.
Cry freedom. Did somebody put in the chat?
I think Marissa.
Frances did, and Dr. Stankish, she added
Yeah.
Taiko as
Yes,
well.
Sorry.
yes.
Yes. Sorry. I thought it was Biko because there's two movies around the same time. They came out around the same time.
Yeah.
But it was that
Yeah.
scene
About
with,
Steve Biko.
that scene with the judge.
Sorry.
The scene with the judge was Cry Freedom, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Any more questions or comments? All right. I guess we're coming to the end of our symposio. Or did you have something, Professor Corbon?
It's just that I feel a bit sad that you're attacking my favorite group, linguists, as the causer of a lot of confusion. Because, but I love it because when you said thinking in mono terms, that everything monolinguistic, monocultural, I always make the joke of God himself. If we say God created the world, that is the Judeo-Christian and Islamic God created the world, and so on. He got very angry and uncontrollable, messy, when he decided that, look, human beings are speaking with one voice, one ideology. I don't like it. I'm the only one who is supposed to do that. So he strikes them, the Tower of Babel, and they cannot understand each other. So God himself is supposed to have created, and I don't know why linguists are trying to now go back to creating a monolingual, monocultural, mono-identificatory, mono-whatever culture that the so-called God of the West fought against since the creation of the world. He's been fighting against it. That's my, I'm just throwing in something light, not an anti-Christian, anti-Judaism, anti-Islamic statement, but go back and read that part of your holy books.
Yes, and so there are lots of people who draw really strong parallels between Western religion and Western science. In fact, some people talk about Western science and capitalism, or Christianity, as the practical side of Western science and Western and capitalism. So there's an interesting relationship. So linguists in particular, though, have a bad case of this science envy, trying to turn the study of language into something that's something that corresponded to what the study of biology or physics was maybe 100 years ago. But of course, physics and biology have moved way beyond that, have become much messier and wild, whereas linguists are still trying to dumb down the study of language into something that's dead and simplistic and domesticated. So this is a problem, particularly in linguistics. But thank you for loving us so much anyway, Professor Cuomo. More questions? Okay, well.
Finally, to end the symposium, we go away surviving, living lives of integrated survivals, not separations. We go away knowing that it's not survival of the fittest, but survival of the, what do you call it? What's the word you guys kept using?
Rhizome?
No, survival of the entangled.
Oh, entanglement, yes.
Yeah, survival of the entangled.
Yes.
Unless you are entangled, unless you are integrated, unless you have poetics of relations, unless you are rhizomatic in your relationship, unless you live in the mangrove ideology, you cannot survive. So I hope that next semester there will be another symposium.
Yes, these symposia happen every semester. This is the 19th one. Towards the end of the semester, and all of you are invited to participate. about a month before you send us your abstract. So if it's the symposium is in April, think about March. If it's in November, think about October. This year was a little bit late in May. But anyway, a month before the symposium happens, send us an abstract, either to Professor Kouabon, to myself, and then once we give you the go-ahead with the abstract, then a week before, send us your slides, and then we'll put you on the program. Also, as Professor Kouabon mentioned, many of these presentations have been turned into publications. So every year we publish 2 volumes on the languages, literatures, and cultures of the Caribbean. And all of you are also invited, not only to present, but to actually contribute to those volumes. The volumes are published in all Caribbean languages. So you can write in English, Spanish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, English Lexifier Creole, French Lexifier Creole, Iberian Lexifier Creole, any of the languages of the Greater Caribbean. We also have contributions from West Africa in those volumes, and so we want to encourage all of you to make as many professional presentations, such as in symposia like this one, as possible, and also to publish as much of your work as possible, because the platforms for presentation and publication in the world today are dominated by the same people, the same institutions that are identified with the imposition of colonial rule in the world. So we need more voices on these platforms from peoples who are at the other end of that dynamic historically. Okay, that said, and with that wonderful poetic ending comment by Professor Kouabon, we hope, we want to thank all of you for your excellent presentations, and we hope to see you at the 20th Simposio Caribe Plurilingue sometime around October or November of next year. So take good care, and virtual hugs to everybody.